Welcome to Oley2022. The Oley Foundation started in 1983 with the goal to support consumers and caregivers who live on home nutrition support. Our mission is striving to enrich the lives of those living with home intravenous nutrition and tube feeding through education, advocacy, and networking. One of the key ways we do that is through our annual conference. Most of us would have preferred to be in person again this year, learning, sharing, seeing new and familiar faces. But in the abundance of caution for the population we serve, the Oley Board of Trustees and Oley staff made the difficult decision to be virtual for 2022. We believe this was the best interest of our community. We also recognize that by having our annual conference virtually, some of our members can attend who would not be able to participate in person. The Oley board and staff have already been working behind the scenes to secure a date and location for Oley 2023. That's right, we are anticipating being able to meet in person again next year for our annual conference. We also plan to have at least part of our conference offered virtually for those who cannot attend in person. Stay tuned for date and location, as we will be sharing that with you as soon as possible. But first, Oley 2022. The Oley staff has been working tirelessly to put on a great program for you. This year, for the first 2 days of conference, we have divided the education in 2 different tracks. One for IV nutrition, also known as parenteral nutrition, we often call it HPN, and one for tube feeding, also known as enteral nutrition, we often call it HEN. Day 1 focuses primarily on medical management. Day 2 focuses primarily on device management. Day 3 focuses on intestinal failure. We recognize that some people are on both therapies. Well, great news! We are recording all sessions. The links will be provided on our website soon after conference. Please note that many of our presentations will immediately be followed by a live question and answer period. You may ask questions at any time during a presentation using the Q&A function. We will answer as many questions as possible. In the interest of time, facilitators will only give a brief introduction of the presenters. You may learn more about them at oley.org/Oley2022. If you need technical support, please call Kathy at the Oley office at 518-262-5079. This afternoon, we hope you will join us for our social hours, 3 to 4 p.m. Eastern. These groups offer a chance for you to connect to other Oley members, whether it's for our trivia and light conversation in the Fun for All group, or share similar experiences with the parents or spouses group, or learn more about the Oley Ambassador Program. Zoom links to join these groups, along with more information about what you can expect from each, are on our conference website. For our younger members, we have Jam and Jammies. Parents, you will need to pre-register your child for this session. Please see our conference website. A big thank you to 9 Meters Biopharma, Nestle, Hanmi, and Abbott for sponsoring these groups. Be sure to check out the marketplace and take the 3 challenges. Consumers and caregivers 18 or older who score at least 80% correctly will be entered into a drawing, and 5 lucky winners will be offered their choice of great prizes. Complete the challenge by 12:30 on Thursday to be entered into the drawing. Winners will be announced Thursday in the closing remarks. Clinicians are also welcome to take the challenges for a fun learning experience. Links to the challenges will be posted at oley.org/marketplace2022. You can find the link to our annual In Loving Memory presentations on our conference webpage, as well as information about the annual walkathon. Thank you to all of you who have or are planning to walk to raise awareness and donations for Oley. After today's session, please complete the conference evaluation. Your feedback is very important. When you leave the meeting later today, watch for an email from Zoom or a prompt on the Zoom screen with a link to the short survey. We want to thank the speakers who have graciously given of their time to create a program that we believe will be educational for you. We thank the clinicians for joining to learn about the patient experience. We thank our generous partners and sponsors for their contributions so we could host this event. And we thank the consumers and caregivers who live with home nutrition support for attending Oley2022. We welcome your feedback during and after the conference on ways we can enhance your experience next time. So whether this is your 39th, 15th, or very first Oley conference, we welcome you to Oley2022, alive, well, and even better.
Greetings. My name is Joan Bishop, Executive Director of the Oley Foundation. I want to thank you for tuning in to this special announcement today. I'll begin by saying it's no surprise that I turned 75 this year. And while I was reflecting on what a wonderful 75 years it has been, at least what I can remember. But my thoughts shifted to the fact that another milestone is that I've entered my 40th year serving the Oley Foundation community. And it's been wonderful. Life is good. But then my thoughts quickly shifted to, okay, you're in a leadership position. Life is good, but have you been responsible in not having a succession plan in place? I had a few conversations with board members recently, and at the end of a 2-day retreat, I was told that they have a succession plan in place for me, and it's a good plan. So life is even better. I can breathe again and resume celebrating my first 75 years. Transitioning to new leadership has begun. It will be seamless. All that you may notice is that the approach to serving the Oley Foundation community will be new and improved, and I look forward to being a part of this important shift. So I'm not going anywhere soon. In fact, at the end of this meeting, I plan to begin searching for a site for Oley2023, which will be planned as an in-person event with a virtual arm. So it's safe to say I will see you in 2023. Now, before I introduce you to the new executive director, I'd like to share a few thoughts about the first 40 years at Oley. Well, I began working with Dr. Lynn Howard in her clinical nutrition micronutrient clinic. It was amazing to learn from this wonderful, extremely committed and passionate person who devoted years and years of learning and working with the home parenteral nutrition and enteral patients to keep them at home, not only alive, but living life. I mean, it was extremely inspiring. So I also need to share a few things that come to mind is there were no computers in our office. We typed. We opened mail. We had envelopes placed on our desk every day. There was no email. Our building was not networked. We had a board member, son, Michael Freeman, set a website up for Oley, but we couldn't view it from our office. We had to go to Albany Medical Center offices and lean over someone's shoulder to be able to view what he had put in place and offer suggestions. When we learned soon after that the building would be networked, we learned we were getting email addresses. First thought we had was, well, I hope we remember to open it, and how life has changed now. So, and thoughts about what the future will bring. I hope that we are able to sort through the reimbursement issues that we're faced with. I hope that we are able to continue our important work serving the community. And I also hope that the financial situation that we face every year continues to keep us fiscally strong and able to do our work. So that's just a snippet of what I'm hoping for, and I hope it's met with the enthusiasm that we have enjoyed over my first 40 years. So I look forward to my 75 and the next 40 with Oley. So for now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Beth Gore, who just rotated off of the board of directors, where she was serving as president, and introduce her as the someone who is assuming the position and title of Oley Foundation Executive Director. I look forward to what the future holds with Beth at the helm.
Thank you, Oley Foundation Board of Trustees, and thank you, Joan. I'm honored and humbled and a little bit overwhelmed. After nearly 40 years of working for Oley and as the executive director for 43 years, Joan, you leave huge shoes to fill. As the executive director emeritus, we are hoping that Joan will be doing the things that she loves, still quite involved, still providing vision, support, and continuity, and doing less and less of the day-to-day operations of the business. Many of you know me, but for those who don't, my story is I am Beth Gore. I live with my husband Dan in Tampa, Florida, with our 6 children, all adopted with special needs. The reason I come to nutrition support is for our youngest, whose name is Manny. He's now 13 years old. He started out as a tube feeder and then ended up with TPN since the age of 2. And at 13, he will be on TPN for the rest of his life. One day I was speaking as a keynote speaker at a conference, and this woman came up afterwards and said, "Hey, can you come speak for us?" That turned out to be Joan Bishop of the Oley Foundation. I came to Oley the very first time. People had told us in hushed tones that, TPN was life limiting and very challenging, and we had found that to be quite true. But we went to Oley and I found my people. I remember thinking, wow, where have these people been all my life? Tube feeding, TPN, and they knew what my life was like. And that was pretty amazing. But what was most amazing is that people knew how to live, not just be alive, but live, truly live. That's what Oley has done for me and for my family. And so somewhere along the way, I felt the need to start to give back. I became the president, and very recently the board of trustees asked me to step up in this role as executive director, because I'm one of you. But I have lots to learn. And I come from a patient safety and patient advocacy world and background. In the fall, the Oley board will be doing some strategic planning. We're going to be seeking feedback between now and then on the key priorities and to see, what do you think should be our key priorities? What should we focus on? And I'll share with you what I'm hoping we will do. One, I'm hoping we will continue to put an emphasis on these educational opportunities such as webinars, annual conference, and so forth. I'm hoping that number 2, we will focus on our membership, both enhancing current member engagement and also identifying and acquiring new members. And number 3, I hope we will increase our national advocacy efforts. For example, Oley just participated in an FDA listening session with consumers and caregivers sharing their experiences. It was quite amazing. I can tell you one really quick story behind the scenes of that. As we were doing the tech demonstration and tech check before the FDA listening session, we had our cameras off, and my children texted me and said, uh-oh, something's wrong with Manny's line, can you check it? So sure enough, I kept on my Zoom live, but my video off, and Manny needed a dressing change, so I did it right then and there. Somewhere along the way, I thought, oh man, it's so good that they can't see what I'm doing. And then I realized, you know what, it would have been better had I left the camera on. They could have seen a day in the life and what it's really like, moment by moment. Like I said, I'm one of you. This is my daily life. Right now, I believe that many in our community believe, and so do I, that we are at a critical crossroad in the world of nutrition support. This is why I think it's so important that we work on national advocacy efforts. For this crisis, it's not just one thing, it's many that have come together all at the same time. And like a snowball gaining speed as it rolls down the hill, when will this hit critical mass? I don't know, but I think it's soon, and so do others. We're dealing with things like reimbursement issues, the stuff that comes, the components, whether it's tube feeding or IV nutrition, the stuff is costing more, and yet they're not being reimbursed higher. The same thing with specialists. They're not being reimbursed at the level that they need to. And so specialists are coming out of this industry and not rejoining. At FASPEN, for example, we had an entire symposium on just this conversation. And then, of course, we're dealing with shortages, supply chain issues, the worst in this industry's history. And ever looming are things like dual therapy coverage issues, like my own son. He has sometimes that he needs trophic feeds, and that's just not covered. There are issues that are happening that need to be addressed on a national basis. Oley's been part of some conversations recently. Should we be part of a coalition, for example? ASPEN, NHIA, DDNC, and a whole bunch of other alphabet soup stakeholder groups have gotten our heads together to say, hey, what could that be? We haven't decided yet, but we think that this is important, and I think Oley should take this on. Maybe it's a national bill of rights for patients on home nutrition support. I've heard Dr. Howard once say that she feels like a failure. And I thought, how can you, as a co-founder of such an important organization as the Oley Foundation, feel like a failure? And she said, because 50 years later, we got people out of the hospital and to home. And he said, now they're in danger of going back in now. They're in danger of going back in now because of things like this national crisis that we're talking about. So I want you to ask yourself, how can I get involved? So one, I call on the consumers and caregivers. One of the most important things that you can do is to use your voice. My personal motto is speak for those who cannot speak for themselves. Will you do that, and will you join with me? Number two, I call on the clinicians and the industry partners. Join us in this. We cannot do this alone. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to say thank you to Joan Bishop for having served the Oley community for so faithfully, for so long. And as Oley enters its 40th year, we will be taking the opportunity to celebrate where we have been. I look forward to working with our community to answer, where do we go from here? What will Oley look like in the next 40 years? And so my call to action is, get involved, use your voice, and as Dr. Howard, our co-founder, says, onward.
Good morning. Welcome to the Oley Foundation's 2022 conference. I'm Lisa Metzger. I am the editor of the newsletter and director of community engagement, and I'll be facilitating this session today. For those of you who are familiar with Oley, that was pretty big news. We're excited to welcome Beth and to work with Joan in her continuing capacity with the Oley Foundation. It's a lot of changes in the past few weeks, and we're very excited, and I'm very excited about the conference today. If you meant to sign up for the home, this is again the home tube feeding session. If you meant to sign up for the IV nutrition session, please call Kathy at the Oley office and she'll help get you in the right place. That phone number is 518-262-5079. And remember, presentations from both this session and the home IV session are being recorded, and the recordings will be available on our website. Remember too that you can type your questions into the Q&A function rather than in chat. We'll answer them through the Q&A function of Zoom. And we'll get to as many questions as possible. Now, before we move on to today's program, I want to remind you about the social hours today from 3 to 4 p.m. Zoom links to join these groups, along with more information about what you can expect from each of the group, are on the Oley Foundation website. That's oley.org/Oley2022, all Oley2022, all one word. And you can choose from Fun for All, sponsored by 9 Meters Biopharma, Parents Cafe, sponsored by Nestle, Spouses Connection, sponsored by HEN, or Meet the Oley Ambassadors. For our younger members, we have Jam and Jammies, sponsored by Abbott. And parents will need to pre-register for your child for this session. Please see oley.org/Oley2022 for more information and to register. So on with the program. Today, we are pleased to welcome Rick Davis as our first speaker. Rick has been on tube feeding for 22 years after a stem cell stroke paralyzed his esophagus. He has served as the Oley Ambassador and as president of the Oley Foundation Board of Trustees. Over the years, Rick has generously shared his time and stories with countless others. Rick, we are grateful you can join us today.
Am I on? I don't know. Can you see me?
Yes, you're there, Rick.
Thank you very much. You know, I don't have very many technical skills, so I'm going to depend on the wizards who are behind the screen to manage all of the controls for me, and I'll just talk about who I am and what I'm doing. There you go. Thank you for honoring me by letting me be the kickoff speaker for the Oley2022 conference. I'm reminded of the Peanuts cartoon where Charlie Brown is getting ready to kick off the football that's being held by Lucy. I hope I do better than Charlie Brown. I used a feeding tube because the right side of my esophagus was paralyzed by a stroke, but the right side of my vocal cords were also paralyzed, so that my voice may sound a little bit strained. I'm going to try and tell you in the few more minutes that I have had a difficult experience as a tube feeder when I first began. I want to tell you about my first Oley experience, which I thought was awesome. Some things that I've learned during the past 20 years, the passion that I have for being an Oley volunteer. How I'm doing currently at 79 years old. I'm going to show you a few pictures, and then I'm going to share some conclusions that I want to leave with you. 22 years ago, I had a stroke, and I lost my ability to swallow. I had been the CEO of a large nonprofit association, about 20 times larger than Oley, but considerably much less important. I was a community leader and a leader in my profession. I went to the gym 3 times a week. I was a skier. I hiked and rode my bike up steep mountain trails. I was in great shape. After my stroke, I was extremely weak. I couldn't walk. I could not work. I could not swallow. I had no social life. I had to use a wheelchair and then a walker. I had trouble saying what I was thinking. And I had a tube up my nose and down my throat. The only thing I knew about feeding tubes was that I saw them sometimes in patients who were dying. After the first day in the hospital, my NG tube was replaced by the standard garden hose tube. I looked pitiful and I felt pitiful. I wanted to get better. In the hospital, I pushed my walker down the hallway, dragging my right leg behind me. At home, I could shuffle and push my walker down our driveway. Soon I could walk a block without using my walker. I went back to the gym and I started using small, tiny weights. I hiked longer and steeper trails. When I had been a CEO, I set annual goals. I measured our progress, and I gradually increased our production. For the physical recovery that I had planned for myself, I did the same thing. I set goals, I measured my progress, and I gradually improved. My doctor said that my swallow would likely recover within 6 months. After 6 months, I was walking, I was lifting small weights, but I had not recovered my swallow. Now my priority was to find a solution for my swallowing problem. I went around the country. I made several trips to Chicago, and then several trips to New York, and then to Houston, seeing the best doctors in the country. The consensus was that I was never going to be able to swallow. Finally, I had to accept my condition. My new priority was to become the best tube feeder that I could be. At the same time, I discovered the Oley Foundation. I attended my first Oley conference in 2002. Whoa, it was awesome. I learned that I had a choice of formulas, a choice of supplies and syringes, a choice of feeding tubes, a choice of home care companies, a choice of ways to feed myself. I had none of those before. I just took whatever was given to me. I learned how to take care of my stoma and my tube. I learned that I could replace that garden hose tube with a low profile button. I learned how to feed myself more efficiently. I learned that tube feeding should not control my life, but rather that I could control my tube feeding and improve my life. I learned how to ask for and receive help from the dozens of doctors, dietitians, scientists, and exhibitors who were at the conference to help us. At one of the sessions, I sat next to Dr. Mark DeLegge, who noticed that I was spitting into a cup every few minutes because I could not swallow my saliva. He told me that I could get a prescription to reduce my saliva. I had been very self-conscious, and his suggestion greatly improved my social life. Most importantly, I met other tube feeders who had similar experiences as me and who wanted to help me learn what they had learned. I even learned a few tube feeder jokes. For example, sitting at a table for dinner while we were on a cruise, one woman asked me, "Why aren't you eating?" I told her, "I gave it up for Lent." She said, "You must be a Christian." Apparently there were a lot of Jewish people on that cruise. At every conference since then, I've learned something new. I've learned to find an example that I can learn from and to be an example for others to learn from. Once a stranger walked up to me and said, "Are you Rick Davis?" I paused, in case he was the husband of some woman that I had been flirting with, but I said yes. He said that an article about me had changed his life. After he had a stroke, he just laid on his couch and felt sorry for himself. My article had helped to start him exercising. He had regained his strength, and he helped me from my example. That taught me the value of media exposure. More interviews and articles followed. Because Oley had been so important to me, I wanted to help Oley as a volunteer. I became an ambassador, and then I was invited to join the Board of Trustees. In 2006, I became the president for a 5-year term. That gave me a chance to be a speaker for medical and supplier meetings. I was able to speak to hundreds of tube feeders and clinicians. Through my speaking and my articles, I reached thousands of others. And I'd like to talk to the wizard behind the screen and suggest that he advance the next slide. Oh, keep going. I think there's a slide. There it is. I was being a speaker at a conference. Thank you, wizard. I tried to set an example with my donations to silent auctions and to the walkathons. My most successful fundraising was a hike across the Grand Canyon. I raised $17,000. Back to the Grand Canyon slide, Mr. Wizard. No, back to the Grand Canyon slide, Mr. Wizard. One more. You'll find it. One more. You'll find the Grand Canyon. There I am. I raised $17,000 for Oley for the hike-a-thon. Currently, the time to feed myself has dropped from 10 hours a day to only 20 minutes, 3 times a day. I go to the gym 3 to 4 times a week. I ski, I hike, I walk on the beach, I travel extensively, I go to dinner with friends, I belong to wine tasting groups. My weight has dropped from 175 pounds to 130 pounds. By decreasing or increasing the volume of formula that I infuse, I keep my body mass index at 21.6. I believe that a healthy diet, regular exercise, a positive relationship with family and friends, and volunteer work are important to keep us healthy, have a good quality of life, and to have a longer life. I've learned it's difficult to cope with being a first-time tube feeder. I've learned that the Oley Foundation may offer the best opportunity to improve our lives. In the beginning, I went from somebody to nobody. Because of Oley, I went from nobody to somebody. Because of Oley, I'm a better person. I'm even better than a normal person. I've also learned that my wife, Diane, will always help me remember who I really am. I was never normal. And wizard, now we get to go to the last slide. This is me talking to my wife and my wife telling me, yes, that's me. I was never normal. And wizard, if there is anybody in the audience of thousands listening to this, they can talk or ask me questions, and I'll try and provide any answers.
Thanks so much, Rick. It's always wonderful to hear your story. I think we're having a little bit of trouble with chat, our chat function, but hoping to get it up and running again soon. If anybody has questions for Rick or even comments on Beth and Joan's, our announcement with that, you can use the question and answer function. That's at the bottom of your screen. It says Q&A. I also wanted to mention that we do have closed captioning enabled, and if anybody had it on during Rick's talk, you'll see it's got a life of its own. We don't monitor it. We don't check it. So we can't correct it, but it does some funny things sometimes. So I just wanted to say that. We are getting some chats now. Rick, we have one just says fantastic. Grateful that you're here. You're still there, right?
Oh, thank you very much. I'm grateful to all of you who helped me.
Rick, there was one slide that shows you on a stage. What was that award? What was that?
That was at the FASPEN conference, the American Society for Parental and Enteral Nutrition, where I was honored by receiving the Lynn Howard Consumer Advocacy Award. And I tried to show a little bit of what I thought was the Aspen logo by holding my jug above my head, and that was well received.
That's clever. I hadn't made that connection previously. Let's see, we have one question. Mark says, I loved your story. I'm really trying to become active again. Do you have advice for overcoming that initial hurdle?
Just have to tell yourself to do it. You have to start slow, take gradual steps, set a goal, measure your progress, and then move from there. Just, for example, to become active, tell yourself to get up and walk 20 steps. If you can do that, set the next goal. Walk 25 steps, set the next goal, 30 steps, etc., etc. Like I did when I was just beginning to walk again. I pushed my walker down the hallway, about 20 tiles in the hallway in the hospital. And then when I got at home, I was able to walk down to the end of my driveway. And then the next day I was able to walk a block. Just do one small step, then do the next. Move from one step to another, measure your progress, keep setting goals.
Thanks, Rick. That's really good advice. I think no matter what our goal is, right? Just have to take it a step at a time and be forgiving of yourself, right?
Be forgiving of yourself, yes.
Somebody else asks, Cynthia Reddick asks, what advice would you give your new to-be self if you could go back in time?
What advice would I give for a new to-be?
Yep. What advice would you give yourself if you were a new tube feeder?
It was 18 months before I actually learned about the Oley Foundation. I was depressed. I was frustrated. I felt isolated. I didn't know anything about tube feeding. I had to struggle with it. If I had learned about the Oley Foundation back when I was brand new, I would have avoided all of that. I could have begun my journey back to well-being and a better quality of life much sooner than I did.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, it's hard to get the word out about the Oley Foundation. Do you have any thoughts on how people can help other new tube feeders find out about the Oley Foundation and make those essential connections?
Thank you, Lisa. What I learned was just do as much self-promotion as you can. Volunteer to be a speaker at your local civic clubs, the Rotary, Kiwanis, etc. Write articles to all of your magazines. Send letters to the editor. Call your local newspaper and tell them you've got a great idea for an interview and a story. Talk about Oley every opportunity that you have. Just create awareness of what you're going through and what the Oley Foundation has done to help you. It really is a shame. There are so many people that don't know about the Oley Foundation, and we can do so much more just to promote ourselves, because it's so unusual for people to meet someone who feeds himself with a tube. I mean, I look normal, even though I'm not, and people are always pleased to find out that I feed myself with a tube. Some people are turned off by that, but they're always curious. So respond to the curiosity.
That's great advice again. Rick, someone is asking what type of formula you use. I know that it's very personalized. Of course, what formula works for an individual is a very personal decision that you have to make with your healthcare provider, but you could say what kind of formula you use.
I use a basic formula. It's not special at all. My formula is made by one of the leading manufacturers. It's called Osmolite. And the dietitians tried several different formulas until I could finally tolerate one. I think it was just a matter of time. Any formula would work. I found that out when I was a speaker at a conference in Washington, D.C., and we were snowed in. All of the airports were closed. I ran out of formula, and I thought, what can I do? I went to a drugstore across the street, and I bought Ensure, also made by the same manufacturer, and I found that I could survive on Ensure for 3 or 4 days. Now, when I travel internationally, I don't even bother to carry my formula with me. I just buy Ensure because Abbott and Nestle are global manufacturers. I can find Ensure in 130 countries. It's very basic stuff. It keeps me alive. It may have a little bit more sugar content than I want. It's not as good for my teeth if I try and drink it because it tastes awful, as Osmoline does. And I try not to swish the Ensure around my mouth. But basic formula, whatever your gut will tolerate is okay, in my opinion.
Thanks, Rick. Yeah, it's good to know too that you went through you tried different things before you and your team found out what worked well. And it's good to know that maybe it's good to know what would work on a short term if there is a kind of an emergency when you can't get what you're used to getting, especially now when different formulas aren't available.
I would only respond that your dietitian knows what's best.
That's great advice. Yeah. We do have somebody asking what medication you use for excess saliva. I suggest that question be tabled till tomorrow because Dr. DeLegge is actually joining us and maybe he can help with that. So let's see. Here's another one that I think is perfect for you, Rick. You mentioned earlier that you did not have a social life. Who did you connect with to support your needs?
Probably my dietitian. My wife was my best supporter, my best friend, my best caregiver. I joke that she looked at me when we left the hospital and was thinking to herself, am I going to have to be with this invalid for the rest of my life? She made sure that I got up and went out and walked every day, just a little bit farther. She pushed me to get better, and with her help, I did.
It's great that you had that support system. Yeah. Actually, this afternoon, just for those who are listening, there is a session specifically for spouses, so you can talk to one another and kind of get some support as a spouse. Rick, somebody else asks if it's common. I mean, all you can do is speak from your own experience, although you've talked to a lot of other tube feeders, but is it common to switch formulas? If one that was tolerable seems to change, I'm not sure what that, I guess maybe if the formula has changed, do you switch formulas? I think that's.
As I said, your dietitian knows best, but if your formula is not working for you, you do need to find something that does work for you. And that's good advice for anything that may go wrong with your tube or your formula. If it's not working, find something that does. Don't be afraid to speak up. Ask your dietitian, your doctor, whoever can help you. Always look for advice. Try and find help. It's available.
It's hard to remember that sometimes. Cynthia had a great question too. What do you wish clinicians, including registered dietitians, doctors, RNs, pharmacists, were more aware of about a day in the life of a home tube feeding consumer?
That is a great question. And my response is that the doctors and dietitians and other clinicians at Oley are great. They really know what we need and they have the kind of empathy that we need. What I am shocked at is that so few clinicians, doctors in particular, who don't know anything about tube feeding. I've been to several emergency rooms and I've had them say, what the heck is this? I've never seen anybody with a feeding tube. All they had available was a catheter tube or a whatever tube they use for people that need to urinate. It's mind-boggling. Even many dietitians don't have a clue about what tube feeding is. And it's all a matter of awareness. You know, the general public don't know very much about us. The medical community doesn't know very much about us. We just need to get the word out.
I'll mention too that we have joined with, we work with the Feeding Tube Awareness Foundation to try to help spread awareness during Feeding Tube Awareness Week, which is in February. So
that's great. The only other advice I would give to our clinicians is touch is very healing. I have found that those dietitians and doctors who touch me while they're talking to me just build a connection. They have empathy. I can feel it.
That's a great point. Rick, I hope that you'll check chat. I haven't read out these, but there are just so many wonderful comments about your presentation that I hope you'll take the time after during the next presentation, perhaps to look at them, just about what an inspiration your talk has been and what it's meant to them. I'm going to ask you
Thank you so much.
One quick question before you go. Somebody asked in the questions how to connect with other tube feeders in their, well, actually they're in Florida and they're in their 70s. I know that we can connect people through the Oley Foundation, and I encourage anybody to reach out to us. We have a new email address that I'll have to get and put in chat. But Rick, do you have any suggestions for how to make connections with other people on tube feeding besides the Oley Foundation?
You know, because of lawyers, a lot of us have difficulty accessing a lot of information because of HIPAA, the Health Information Protection and Privacy Act. We can't share the names of patients or information about them. I've tried several times to ask Oley to put me in touch with other people. Oley ambassadors are sometimes the best resource to put us in touch with other people they know in their particular region. There's a Facebook group for Oley members. Getting on that Facebook group is good. Look for all of the references to Oley's members on Google. Try and find every possible way to make connections. I get a lot of comments and questions from Oley members who recognize me from the website, and sometimes they'll just volunteer that they live in my area of Florida, and I'm thrilled to be able to meet other people that live nearby me, and I'd like to get to better know them and get together with them. So yeah, please try and reach out.
Thanks, Rick. Thanks again for your presentation. It really is always just such a pleasure to hear your story and to your generous spirit and sharing it. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Next, we'll hear a brief message. We invite you to please enjoy brief messages from two of our Oley corporate sponsors. We couldn't put on this conference without their support. And following these videos, we'll learn more about Blenderized tube feeding, which is always a popular topic, for adults and children, from Lisa Ebb. Lisa is a registered dietitian nutritionist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. And please remember to type your questions into the Q&A function. It's much simpler for us to find them there than to look in the chat. So with that, we'll have our sponsors, word from our sponsors, and then followed by Lisa Epp's presentation. Thank you.
Hundreds of thousands of people tube feed daily. They deserve a better feeding experience. At Rockfield Medical Devices, our founder and CEO is a tube feeder who had an innovative idea for a mobile tube feeding system. Mobility Plus is a feeding pouch which has an elastomeric pump that can hold up to 500 milliliters of feed. It works without electricity or gravity. It's light, quiet, and easy to use. It is wearable and can be worn in clothing or a bag of choice, allowing users to have active physical and social lives while feeding discreetly. This could transform users' mobility and quality of life. The pouch is filled using filling set tubing, which can be connected to a hanging bag or placed into a container of feed. Using a syringe, the feed is pumped from the container through the filling set into the pouch. As the pouch is filled, the elastomeric pump inflates. Once the filling set is removed, the feed is sealed inside. Feed is delivered to the user via giving set tubing. When inserted into the pouch and the tubing clamp is opened, the elastomeric pump begins to contract, allowing the feed to be delivered in a controlled manner. 4 giving sets of differing length are available, which allow for the flow rates that users require. Mobility Plus works with commercial enteral feeds. It is single patient use, can be used multiple times over a 24-hour period, and is disposable. Mobility Plus is intended for patients aged 2 years and older in clinical or home care settings. Rockfield Medical Devices are committed to bringing our products to the hundreds of thousands of daily tube feeders who deserve a better feeding experience. For more information, visit our website. Rockfield Medical Devices, the future of tube feeding.
Real Food Blends is a line of real food meals made for people on feeding tubes. We gave AJ the title of Chief Inspiration Officer from day one because we never would have known anything about tube feeding if it weren't for him. When AJ got his feeding tube around 6 months old, he was placed onto formula. He went through about 8 different formulas over the next 6 months. He was chronically constipated and throwing up every single day. Every time we were feeding him, we were petrified that it was going to come back out, he wasn't going to get enough calories, or that he had thrown up his meds. That was kind of my breaking point to say, you know what, there's got to be a better way. We did some research and thought, let's try and see if food works through his feeding tube, and it did.
We were excited to see that he was happier. That made us a much happier family.
You know, there is a huge psychological element to feeding your child. We eat meals together at the dinner table, and so when that was taken from us, that experience with him, it was heartbreaking on a level we didn't quite realize. And so being able to, give him real food was healing in a lot of ways. Very quickly we realized there were a lot of challenges. So there was the time commitment to doing all of the blending. There was the storage aspect. So travel was next to impossible.
I'll never forget. It was like 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the floor after we have already been blending on vacation and stressed out, and just kind of looked at each other like, there's got to be a better way. There's got to be other families out there like us, and they want to be able to live with a feeding tube, not just survive. And that led to Real Food Blends.
Real Food Blends provides a variety of real food. We didn't want to create one particular formula of real food because that's not how people eat. You get different benefits from a sweet potato that you do from green beans. And we wanted people on feeding tubes to be able to experience that as well.
Lisa M., are you ready for me?
We are, Lisa. You're all set. You're on camera and ready to go. My understanding was you were going to show your own slides. Is that good?
That was my understanding. However, it's marked on my screen, host has disabled screen sharing.
So we'll address that momentarily, I think, probably at this moment. Don's working on that.
All right, and then I can share my screen, no problem.
I know that we're going to have a lot of people always interested in your topic, the blenderized tube feeding.
Well, following Rick is pretty hard. You know, I feel like I need to like do a show over here because he's just such a dynamic speaker.
It's a great way to kick off our session today.
Okay, I think I am able to show my slide. Okay, so hi everybody. My name's Lisa Epp. I'm a dietitian at Mayo in Rochester. I have a passion for blenderized tube feeding and capacity, but I in no way claim to know everything. So I hope to just kind of share a little bit of my experience and my knowledge with you all today. Here are my disclosures. So today we're going to look a little bit more at the literature. I know that some consumers will say, you know, I wish I had some more kind of proof to share with my healthcare team that using blenderized tube feeding might be beneficial to me. So we're going to talk about some of the literature, some of the benefits, and then reviewing some of the options for recipes and commercial products. I'd like to start. This is kind of a new concept for me to start with saying, like, what is blenderized tube feeding? Because we've never had a standardized definition, I feel like blenderized tube feeding has been given a variety of different names. And so when I say blenderized tube feeding, what I mean is blended foods and liquids that are given via a feeding tube. Now, it may include modulars such as protein powder or may include commercial formula as well. But you can see here I've listed out some other terms that other people have used for blenderized tube feeding. Really all means the same thing. So starting with kind of why would someone consider using blenderized tube feeding? Some of these are anecdotal and some of these all are supported by evidence, but we'll talk about that in a minute. So improved bowel functions and such as improving diarrhea or improving constipation. Improve the diversity of the gut microbiota or that good bacteria that's in our gut. Increase patient satisfaction or caregiver satisfaction, decrease in those upper GI symptoms like gagging, retching, vomiting, cost savings or decrease healthcare utilization, decrease hospitalization, being able to accommodate family food preferences or food allergies, improve quality of life, and potentially help with volume intolerance. So when we look at kind of this list, we do have some evidence that's emerging that really supports some of these benefits. Now, I want to say that the literature that I am focusing on is from 2010 moving forward. Even though blenderized tube feeding is not a new concept and dates back really hundreds of years, that modern day blenderized tube feeding that we're talking about really kind of reemerged around 2010. And so that's the literature that I'm focusing on for this presentation. So in 2010 to 2020, we had really just a sprinkling of articles that were in medical journals that started to show us, maybe there is some actual benefit to using blenderized feeding. And so one of the first ones was in 2011 when a study of 33 children that were given primarily baby foods or a commercial product had a decrease in retching, gagging, decrease in negative GI symptoms, and actually had an increase in oral intake. This study has been cited time and time again as kind of one of those initial reasons for a medical reason for using blenderized tube feeding. So then moving on a couple years later, another study came out with children who have short bowel syndrome. And so these children were mostly on an elemental formula or on TPN. And of those, 9 of the 10 children that they looked at were able to transition off of an elemental formula onto blenderized feeding and had an improvement of stooling. If any of you struggle with this disorder, having high output makes it hard to stay hydrated. And so that was kind of the first time that we saw that blended food might decrease that stool output. Moving on to 2018, a study of 20 children that were on a standard formula, and 17 of them were transitioned to a homemade blenderized formula. And this was actually a group that was given a Vitamix blender. They were given specific recipes for their own personal situation, and found that there was decreased vomiting, there was increase in that good bacteria in the gut, and unanimously caregivers which were much more satisfied and would recommend using the blenderized feeding versus a commercial product. So the last study I have listed on this side is when this group was actually given a commercial blenderized formula, so a formula that was blenderized in a pouch, and were able to transition a group to this product, and basically found when you look at the pediatric GI scores, which look at like reflux and vomiting and diarrhea, all of the patients that were transitioned to the pouch blenderized product had an improvement in these scores. So less nausea and vomiting, less abdominal pain, less bloating, less diarrhea. So you can kind of see there's similarities between these 4 studies. Number 1, they're all in pediatric patients. And number 2, they're relatively small sample sizes, which is pretty common for nutrition research in general, just because it is hard to kind of just look at a formula or just look at a nutrition intervention and control for everything else. You can see here in the last 3 years, though, that we've really started to see an uptake in publications related to the benefits of blenderized feeding. So in 2020, Catherine Bennett and her group put out a nice paper. I reference it a lot for different things, but I think that the part that might be appealing to consumers is this is kind of the first time where we saw where using blenderized tube feeding might save money. And so it showed that this group was in the emergency department had less hospitalization, so less healthcare utilization, which I think is as we're seeing healthcare as a customer service industry, that is really a great benefit to have decreased healthcare utilization. So each of these studies has some form of the first of the 4 studies I mentioned. So like in 2022, just a month or so ago, Zhang and colleagues had a study where, again, children with short bowel syndrome had improvement in stooling, improvement in clinical outcomes with using a blenderized diet. So you can see that the literature is increasing, and just like with everything, I think COVID did slow some research down a little bit. And so I'm seeing all of the sudden now a big increase in people finishing up studies and getting things published. But again, most of these studies really are talking about children. And therefore, we can only kind of extrapolate that into adult practice. This is a nice graphic that kind of goes through some of the studies that talk about the clinical improvements with using blenderized feeding. And a couple things I want to point out in that middle column where it says type of BTF or type of formula, you can see in general, it varies. Some of it's home blends, some of it is commercial products, and sometimes it's somewhere in between. You can see that all of the studies did show an improvement in upper GI symptoms. So reflux, vomiting, gagging has decreased in all the studies. But other than that, each of the studies have kind of showed a spattering of different improvements, either with stooling or with good gut bacteria, improvement of quality of life. So I do think it's important to kind of note that regardless of the blenderized tube feeding type and regardless of the study, those upper GI symptoms were the main finding that was consistent throughout these studies here. So as far as I'm aware, this is really the only adult study that has been done. And so this was an open label pilot that was done by our group here at Mayo, where we gave a recipe that was for the individual along with a blender, and had them just go home and do home blending for 6 weeks. Really, all we were trying to do is prove that it was safe. Because to be honest, when we tried to do this back in 2015, our institutional review board, which looks at kind of the research safety of things, wasn't sure that there was enough evidence to show that this was safe. And so that kind of really sparked my interest to say is we need to make sure that there is evidence out there that using real food for people who have feeding tubes is safe to do. So what we found with this pilot is all of the patients tolerated the feeding well. None of them got any foodborne illness, so no hospitalizations for foodborne illness or infections at feeding tube sites. And everyone was able to maintain their weight appropriately, whether that have been if we wanted a little bit of weight loss that happened, or if we wanted weight maintenance that happened. And so again, this is, that I'm aware of, the only adult study that really shows that like blenderized feeding did go well. So kind of to piggyback on what Rick was saying, I think that this whole movement toward blenderized feeding is really part of that patient-centered care. Instead of those days where a healthcare provider would walk in the room and say, hey, you have a feeding tube and this is what you're going to do with it, starting that conversation where the patient is included in the decision. And I realized that for patients in the hospital, like for Rick, when you had your stroke and if you were in the ICU, having a conversation with you about what formula you wanted to try first probably wasn't very appropriate. But starting to include patients in those decisions as soon as possible, I think is very important. And there are 130 or more formulas on the market. It seems like more are coming out daily. So in my practice, I think a great place to start is, what type of diet did you have prior to needing the feeding tube? Or if it's a child, what type of diet does the family eat? And trying to mimic that. So that's a good place to kind of start. And for consumers, asking to be part of that decision right off the bat, I think is really important. This is another table that I just wanted to bring up because I think it brings in that patient-centered approach. So that article that I mentioned by Catherine Bennett and her colleagues, this is taken from that. And, they really list out, when you look at home blending versus commercial blenderized product, what the pros and cons might be. And again, this is where I really like to pull in the caregiver. So for example, in this paper, they note that there might be decreased caregiver burnout if they use a commercial product, and there might be increased caregiver burnout if they use home blending. But if you've ever talked to a parent who has, or even a patient themselves who has thrown up every feeding for 3 months, that causes so much stress and burnout that sometimes they are just so happy that home blending is working. And that might feel offensive to someone to say, oh, you're going to be too burned out if you make home blending yourself. You should just use a commercial product instead. So never assuming, allowing that, that patient interaction. The other part that I like to point out here, because I feel like this gets lost a little bit, and it was mentioned in the Real Food Blends segment before we started, was the hang time. So when we blend food from our refrigerator, it can't be at room temperature for longer than 2 hours. And if you live somewhere where it's greater than 90 degrees, it's 1 hour. And so unfortunately at this time, we don't have any evidence that supports using ice packs extends the shelf life, or freezing and thawing, or anything like that. Unfortunately, we just don't have any evidence that shows that hang time is extended past 2 hours. And so some people feel like that might be the benefit of using a commercial blenderized product, because some of those have a hang time up to 12 hours. Again, looking just at pros and cons here, but I never want to assume a pro or a con with a specific consumer situation because everybody is different. So let's talk about practical planning. I do feel like more and more caregivers are being open to using blenderized feeding as it becomes more published and more common practice. And so if you yourself were thinking, okay, I want to get started, what would be the first step? And in my opinion, this would be the first step is talk to your primary care provider or your child's primary care provider. Have a nutrition professional available to assist you. In general, a gastrostomy tube would be preferred that would be 12 French or bigger, though some smaller French sizes do work with thinner home blends and some of the commercial blends. Have a system for monitoring just to make sure things are going well, and then having the tools needed. So what are those tools? I love this picture because my youngest daughter is 13 now, but I remember walking into her room when she was younger and she was playing with her dolls and this was set up on the floor. And I said, oh, what is this? And she's like, oh, I just thought it would be fun to play how you work. And I thought, wow, I'm surprised you really even exactly know what I do as a dietitian. So I love using this picture because yes, it reminds me that my kids do know what I do. And so the tools that are needed here, I have listed. Again, everybody finds what works for them, but in general, these are the tools that I find helpful. So having a straight connector for a low profile tube instead of a right angle connector, it just makes it so that thicker blend doesn't have to go around the corner, which can cause some clogs. O-ring syringes can be easier to push with the thicker formulas, especially with the fat content. Having large bore gravity bags instead of small bore gravity bags. A feeding pump may be used. However, the rate on the pump might need to be increased to compensate for the thicker formula. Priming definitely takes longer, and the feeding times might be inconsistent. So what do I mean by that? Like, let's say you wanted 100 mils an hour over 1 hour. So 100 mils at 100 mils an hour. You might actually have to increase that feeding rate to 120 mils an hour to actually make it flow at 100 mils an hour. So that's why most of the manufacturers of feeding pumps don't recommend using home blends with their products because they're really not made for that. But I have heard that there are some companies working on a pump that would more appropriately work with thicker formulas. So I guess we'll keep our eye out for that. The reusable tube feeding pouches are another great option for a tool that can administer a home blend or a commercial blenderized product. But I really do encourage you to try to avoid using strainers and sieves. The studies kind of prior to 2010 that really kind of talked negatively, I would say, about home blending. This was a very common practice, and it did lead to micronutrient deficiencies, vitamin deficiencies, as well as weight loss, because a lot of the food that was being blended was actually thrown away from the sieve or the strainer. And so we don't want to waste that nutritional value. So I like this slide because it kind of gives an idea of, I think, what a lot of consumers feel like. It's just food and water. What are people getting so worried about? And that is my philosophy as well. So it's taking what my family would normally eat for dinner, putting it in a blender and making it consistency that would go through a feeding tube. So like you saw in the studies that we kind of briefly looked through, and this is my personal practice as well, there is so much variety out there for blenderized feeding. It's not a one size fits all. So you might be someone who uses a standard formula and you use that every day, but you and your family went out strawberry picking and everybody's eating strawberries and you think, I'm just going to blend some of the strawberries in my standard formula because I want to partake in this event that my family is enjoying and I want to enjoy that with them. You might use a food-based product or a commercial blenderized product, but add additional foods maybe that aren't in there. Maybe you love garden tomatoes this time of year and that's not in your blend. And so you take your commercial product and you blend in those garden tomatoes because you want to get that food into your diet. Using just a commercial blenderized product, that's an option. Doing home blending, or somewhere in between. Sometimes you might do one, sometimes you might do another. So this is an option of what I mean by using a standard formula and adding foods to it. This is also a great way to kind of get your feet wet, so to speak, with blenderized feeding, is saying, okay, my child or myself, I use a standard 1 cal per mil formula for my breakfast, and I use 2 cartons for breakfast. Well, instead of doing that, I'm kind of interested in starting some home blending. I'm going to take that 1 carton, and then instead of doing the second carton, I'm going to add a half a banana, a half a cup of oatmeal, a half a cup of blackberries, and make kind of that thicker formula for breakfast. And you can see here that would create a breakfast meal that would be 400 calories. So in general, this is a good way to kind of get started. Some other options would be to use commercial products that are in a pouch or in a carton and add extra foods either for calories or just for personal preference. So you can see here some options of using fruit or adding some coconut oil or peanut butter to a commercial product to add additional foods in. Or you might be someone that says, you know what, I just want to make my own recipes every meal, every day, or a standard recipe. What are some options for how I would do that? And so I really look at 4 options. The first one is to use exchanges, which I'll show you here in a minute. The second one is to use a standard recipe every day. I don't love this idea because it kind of takes away a couple of the benefits that we've seen with using blenderized feeding, which is, more variety of foods might increase the variety of good bacteria in your gut. So using a standard recipe every day might take away from that, but also just the psychological benefits of using home blending related to cooking and preparing food the family is eating. Most people don't eat the same thing every day. And so using a standard recipe maybe is my least of the 4 choices here. Using my plate or family meals to make recipes, and I'll show you how to do that in a second, or using a recipe builder. For example, Complete has a free recipe builder, and I'll talk about that in a second as well. So let's look at exchanges. So this is a 500 calorie recipe using exchanges. And basically what exchanges means is that it would have a variety of foods and variety of food groups that would likely meet the micronutrient needs without having to use any kind of vitamin or mineral supplementation. So you can see here that, so our group here at Mayo, we have tested this recipe using all of the foods that are listed here. But for example, I'll have people ask me, hey, instead of, pasta in here, could I use quinoa instead? And yes, once you get kind of good at blending, you can more easily swap out foods in each category. But this is a nice way to get started. You know that the recipe is going to be about 500 calories, and you know it's going to be, because of the water content of the foods, a consistency that will go through a feeding tube, no problem. This is an example of a standard recipe that we have for our hospital here. We have standard recipes at different calorie levels. And so these recipes are mostly used, honestly, with foods that are available in a hospital setting. But in general, just gives you an idea of a kind of a balanced recipe that would meet micronutrient needs and have appropriate carbohydrate and protein and fat in 1,000 calories, if that's the calorie level that you were looking for. The My Plate plan is kind kind of my preferred method, I would say. So on the USDA website, there's a great option where you can go and kind of click what calorie level are you looking for. And of course, it's made for people who are eating orally, but people who are putting food through a tube have those same nutrition needs. And so this is a recipe for 1,400 calories, or kind of a meal plan for 1,400 calories. So it would go through and give you an idea of like how many fruits, how many vegetables, how many grains, how much protein would be needed to kind of make it a balanced recipe. And then you can kind of write those foods if you have recipe sheets, and that can kind of help you build your recipes. That's really similar to what they have on the Complete website. And so essentially you choose a calorie level, you choose foods from each category, like it will say, choose 3 fruits, choose 3 vegetables. The nice thing about it is next to each food, it also tells you how many milliliters that food will add to the blend. So if you have volume intolerance, you can say, okay, what adds the least amount of volume? And then it gives you at the end kind of a recipe summary that would say, okay, this recipe has this many calories, this much protein, and may be low in calcium or may be low in vitamin D, and therefore you may need a supplementation. And so it really gives you kind of a way to build recipes on your own. In general, the recipes are 1 calorie per milliliter, and they go up to 2,000 calories. So if you would need more than 2,000 calories, it is kind of built for pediatric patients, but you could definitely double or triple a recipe as well. And so it just gives you some different options for building recipes if you are interested in doing that on your own. I like this slide because one of the common kind of questions I get or just comments I get is, I have volume intolerance or my child has volume intolerance. How can I add nutrient dense foods in each category with a lot of calories and not a lot of volume? So in each category, meaning fat, dairy, fruit, vegetable, and grain, I just have some ideas here of foods that in general are low volume that have 100 calories that could be added to a blend to kind of bump up the calories without adding too much volume. So lastly, I just want to put a plug here. So FASPEN, so Rick had mentioned, American Society for Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, is working currently on clinical recommendations for blenderized tube feeding. And this is expected to be published later this year, but these are some of the things that you can expect from it. And I really do think once FASPEN publishes this, a lot of that reservation that some of your clinicians might have is going to be taken away, because they're going to see a major society has given recommendations on how to do blenderized feeding both in the hospital and at home. And I think that's just going to be beneficial then to the consumers who are interested in doing this. So with that, I will take whatever questions Lisa wants to throw my way.
Okay, we have a couple. One is, I think, let's see. If you were to blend scrambled eggs with your formula, would the thickness help with reflux or GERD?
I think potentially yes. I will tell you, if you're going to add one food to your formula because you want to help with GERD, green beans has actually been studied to help with thickness and kind of help with weight. And so I think eggs would definitely help. But if I was looking at evidence, green beans has been used in a variety of different settings to help with reflux and stooling as well.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. Another one is a little bit longer, that one of our participants notes they have problem with small intestinal bacterial overgrowth They've been trying different foods and have found that sometimes it makes the SIBO worse. The person says, as the motility is a little improved, I've been trying to eat or blend some foods, but have been having trouble with the intestinal bacterial overgrowth. Do you have any advice for choosing foods to blend that would not irritate the overgrowth?
I think what's hard about answering a study like this is, small intestinal bacterial overgrowth is a medical thing. And so in general, our team and my philosophy is we can't use nutrition to treat a medical diagnosis. But in general, if you did not have a feeding tube and you have small bowel bacterial overgrowth, eating a wide variety of foods is the recommendation. And so you might find things that, work for you or don't work for you. But in general, there's no list of foods that you should not be having. And there's really no list of foods that you should be having. It would be a wide variety of foods. And so this is where, and actually even at Aspen this winter, they even started talking about using potentially in the future blenderized feeding in the ICU to help with bacteria in the gut.
Thanks, Lisa. Let's see, another question is comments how wonderful your resources are, and thank you. And then the question is, what would you recommend as the best resource to share as a registered dietitian to share with fellow dietitians? And in your experience, has collagen been studied or added to any blenderized recipes?
As a registered dietitian, when I have been asked questions, and I have been asked questions like, aren't you worried about liability, or aren't you worried that, something's going to go wrong? The reference that's most helpful is the Registered Dietitian Nutritionist Guide to Homemade Blenderized Tube Feeding, which is out for a couple of years and produced by the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. So I feel like that is the best resource for clinicians to get started, but also to feel comfortable that yes, this is part of standard practice, that this is safe and this is okay to use. I'm not aware of collagen specifically being studied with blenderized feeding.
Thanks, Lisa. And this will be the last one today. I think there are a couple of other questions, but we're going to run out of time. But can you comment on, well, and actually, we can cover this in more detail tomorrow, but it's on, can you comment on blenderized tube feeding and ENFit? So ENFit is a new connector that we'll be talking about in more detail tomorrow when we talk about devices. But do you have a quick answer to that, Lisa?
Yeah, I'll say my quick answer is, and I think this will be shared tomorrow, but we have done some studies here with using our blenderized recipes with ENFit. And really overall, I would say we have no problems with using them. About 50% of our 2,000 patients use blenderized feeding in some capacity. We've been using ENFit for more than 2 years, and we still have 50% using blenderized tube feeding. So it's definitely possible.
Thanks, Lisa. I don't know if you're able to be on the line a little bit, but there are some other questions in the Q&A. And if you have a few minutes, if you want to try to address any of them, written, that would be wonderful. But if you can't, that's certainly understandable. I will say that we have, I think it's Lisa that has done a webinar for us in the past on blenderized tube feeding, and there are some other resources on our website too, where you may be able to get some of those questions answered. So thank you, Lisa. Really appreciate it, and look forward to hearing from you again soon in the future.
Sounds good.
Okay. And thank you too for our corporate sponsors for their support. Next, Dr. Manpreet Mundi will discuss recent research about peptide diet in adults and children on tube feeding. Dr. Mundi is the medical director of clinical nutrition and of a home enteral nutrition program at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. He and Lisa work closely together. He is also the associate program director of the Mayo Home Parental and Enteral Nutrition Program. And he is the science and medicine advisor for the Oley Foundation. Dr. Mundi's presentation has been pre-recorded because he was unable to join us this week. So I'm afraid there's no question and answer with Dr. Mundi's presentation. So following Dr. Mundi's talk, we'll go directly to Mary Kuehl, a registered dietitian, who will address the important issue of skin problems and other tube feeding complications. So without further ado, we will present Dr. Mundi's presentation. Thank you.
My name is Manpreet Mundi. I'm honored here to be invited to talk to you about home enteral nutrition, use of peptide-based formulas. These are my disclosures, and I do want to point out that some of the research that I'll be discussing today was funded by Nestle, and we're always grateful for their support. What I really want to do over the next 20 or so minutes is to describe the prevalence and benefits of enteral nutrition, show you how the use of home enteral nutrition has increased over the last few decades, but then really go into data showing that, home enteral nutrition intolerance is quite prevalent, and we need to look for ways to guide our patients or consumers on what to do next if they're intolerant to their current formula. And I want to highlight that one option that's really emerging is to use peptide-based formulas. Always like to start my presentations with a patient. In this case, we have a 50-year-old female with a severe reflux who underwent a Nissen fundoplication. She did quite well for a long period of time, but then her symptoms started to return. At this time, she had gained some weight and also had obesity-related complications of diabetes, high blood pressure, sleep apnea. And so because of this, she was then converted to a Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, which you could see the picture in the corner there. But unfortunately, after the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, she started getting abdominal pain. Dietary changes were attempted to start with, and there was no response. Upper GI was performed as well as an EGD and showed perhaps the gastric pouch was distended and enlarged. So in this setting, she underwent a revision because she really wasn't able to tolerate much oral intake. But after the revision, she kept having the same symptoms: postprandial abdominal pain, so after eating, some nausea and even vomiting. CT scan was done and showed some fluid collection around the pancreas. EGD was done, and they thought they saw a stricture at the connection between the esophagus and the jejunum there. So that was dilated, but none of this helped in terms of her symptoms, and her weight kept going down. So at this point, just, thinking out loud, what should we do next in terms of nutrition? Do we work with a dietitian and try to switch her to a liquid diet to see if she tolerates that better and there's less nausea, vomiting? Or do we think that oral intake, food through the mouth, is not going to work, so we need to initiate enteral feeding? And then what's the best way to do this? Should we do a nasal tube, a tube that goes from the nose to the intestines? Or should we put in a percutaneous tube, or one that goes directly into the stomach? Or do we think the gut in this case is not going to work and we should try parenteral nutrition? And so whenever we, kind of come to a decision like this, I always go back to my training and some of my mentors, and they always mention, if the gut works, we should use it. And studies, over the last few decades have shown over and over again that there's significant benefit to using the gut if it works, right? And most recently, and I won't go through all of these details with you, there's immune benefit, inflammation, right? But more recently, we're starting to see that there's also benefit to our microbiome, and that can be quite influential with impact throughout the body. And studies, again, as I mentioned, have shown this. This is a study from Burns patients again, meta-analysis combining a number of other studies showing significant benefit in terms of mortality, right, in terms of GI hemorrhage, sepsis, hospital stay, renal failure, pneumonia. We see in the critically ill, number of guidelines and other studies have shown benefit, cost benefit, lower infection rates, right? Dr. McClave led the most recent guidelines and did a meta-analysis through there, again, showing benefit of using enteral nutrition, right? So I think if the gut works, we should try our best to use it. That's pretty much the indication for enteral feeds, right? But in situations where we're not able to meet nutritional needs to oral intake, we sometimes have to rely on enteral nutrition or using some sort of tube to provide that. In terms of avoidance, really, the main contraindications are life expectancy, that's less than 1 month, or where the GI tract is not functioning, like if you have an obstruction, bleeding, or you have a risk of severe malabsorption that could be found in certain situations. So with this and all of the data that has emerged over the last few decades, we've seen that the use of home enteral nutrition has also increased significantly. This was a study we did where we were able to find Medicare data from 2013 and noted that in the U.S., over 100,000 Americans were on home enteral nutrition being covered by Medicare. We then partnered with 3 of the largest infusion companies, DME providers that were in the U.S., and looked at their ratio of Medicare to non-Medicare. And using this ratio, we were able to estimate that over 437,000 Americans are on enteral nutrition in 2013. We compared this to work by Dr. Lynn Howard and noted that this number had dramatically increased since the 90s. You can see that here, 152,000 or 597 per million, going up to 437,000 and 1,385 per million. So big increase, and I think rightfully so. But what about use of enteral nutrition in people who are post-bariatric surgery? This is our own experience from our center. 72 patients that we found between 2013 and 2018 had initiated home enteral nutrition due to some complication after bariatric surgery. You can see that 86% were female. Most of the patients going through bariatric surgery are female, so this made sense. Most common surgery was Roux-en-Y gastric bypass, and the sleeve has really come on, on its own in the last few years. So it'll be interesting to reanalyze this data in 5 or 10 years and see if this still holds out. Here's the mean age, around 50 at the time of starting enteral nutrition. And the most common route that we use for enteral nutrition was actually a nasal jejunal tube. Other routes that we looked at included putting in a tube directly into what's considered the remnant stomach here, as I'm showing you, versus a nasal gastric tube versus putting in a tube directly into the intestines. So that's with the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. With a sleeve gastrectomy, again, nasal gastric tube was used in 9% of cases and nasal jejunal tube in 36% of cases. In equally 36% of cases, patients also had a direct tube placed into the jejunum, and then 9% had it directly placed into the stomach. And there's indications for using home enteral nutrition. Nausea and vomiting, similar to our patient, as well as malnutrition, were some of the most common ones that we found. So that's what we did with our patient. We actually tried enteral feeds through nasal tube. It worked well. And then we went ahead and placed a G tube into the remnant stomach and started nutrition there, right? And here comes the next question, which is, what formula should we start with? And luckily, we've had a significant advance in the types of formulas that are available in the market. We now have, standard polymeric formulas. Those have always been there. But blenderized tube feeding, and I know Lisa Epp is providing a lecture on this as well and has done so in the past. But that is also something that is emerging along with complete whole food ingredient containing formulas, right? This is something that needs a lot more exploration to see if, there are significant benefits in this population. There's also peptide-based diets or formulas, and I'll use that term interchangeably. But here what happens is that the protein is enzymatically broken down into di and tripeptides. So normally these proteins are long chains of amino acids, but they're broken down into chains of 2 or 3, sometimes even smaller. The lipids are also provided as medium chain triglycerides. So we have long chain triglycerides, which essentially refers to the carbon chain length, and some of the long chain, they'll contain between like 13 and 22 carbons or 24, and then you start to get into very long chain. But some of the medium chain triglycerides, these are between 6 and 12 or 13 carbon lengths. And so I'll share with you some of the benefits that this can have. Then there's also elemental formulas where you're truly having the formula being broken down, so the protein is individual amino acids, right? But when we look at the guidelines, we have the European Society of Parenteral and Enteral Nutrition, the Home Enteral Nutrition Guidelines, again recommend starting with standard commercial formula. The ICU guidelines, both from FASPEN and ASPEN, also recommend starting with standard polymeric formula. And this has been our experience as well. The standard polymeric formulas, those were the ones that we use the most common in our post-bariatric surgery patients. And what we found is that in most cases, we were able to meet their nutritional needs, but complications were quite common. Tube malposition, occlusion, entry site, redness, exudate, or some sort of tube damage, right? These were some of the most common ones that we saw. So in our patient, we started on high protein standard polymeric formula, but unfortunately she called pretty soon after starting and said she was only able to get to about half of what she needed. She started to feel bloated after her feeds, increased abdominal pain. She described it as like this ice pick moving around. She was constipated as well. And so again, what would we do next in this situation? Do we think about changing to a formula with fiber? Do we add some pancreatic enzymes thinking maybe she's not absorbing? Do we consider a peptide-based formula? Switch her to continuous feeds instead of like feeding her breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Or do we change her to parenteral nutrition thinking she has intestinal failure? So let's just pause and kind of look at this concept of enteral nutrition intolerance. And a lot of data exists from the hospitalized patients where it's a lot easier for us to gather this data. In this study, almost 1,888 patients who were critically ill from 167 ICUs were reviewed for their enteral nutrition tolerance. And they noted that almost 30.5%, so almost a third of them, had some complaint of intolerance. And they sort of labeled these as an interruption in enteral nutrition due to a large residual volume, abdominal distension, vomiting, diarrhea, or discomfort. Another study looked at almost 754 hospitalized patients, again, broken down into ICU and non-ICU patients, and they saw overall, same thing, about a third experienced intolerance. In the ICU, 36%, non-ICU, 26%. And you could see the difference there. Non-ICU, nausea, vomiting, abdominal pain, distension, diarrhea, a lot more than large residual volume, which we've stopped really using in the ICU. But you can see intolerance in the hospitalized patient is quite prevalent. But what about the home enteral nutrition population? And here we meticulously have gathered kind of our data from our population between January 1st, 2018 and December 31st, 2020. So almost 3 years of data, 1,600 patients. You can see their general breakdown indications, the formulas we're using. But when we looked at this, more than half had some complication at a point in terms of their home enteral nutrition. 34% experienced some complication related to their tube, 20.6% related to their enteral nutrition, and almost 22% metabolic or electrolyte complication, right? When we looked at their tube complications, you could see granulation tissue, infection, leakage, falling out, breaking down, damage. But when we looked at their enteral feeding intolerance symptoms, what do they present with? Nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, constipation, bloating, abdominal pain, reflux symptoms were all quite common, right? So in this situation, we can quickly realize that enteral nutrition intolerance is quite common. And we have to have a skill set to look for like different options that we could provide this patient. And in this situation, we tried quite a bit. We started by changing to fiber containing formula. We provided the formula slower, lengthening it to 30, 45 minutes per feeding. When none of these worked, we then even started providing the formula continuously, so using a pump and providing it slower. But she continued to have symptoms, right? Gas, bloating, abdominal pain, like I've described before. In fact, when we looked back at her records, she called us over 7 times and sent us multiple in-basket messages. She even went to the emergency department. CT scan was done, and you could imagine the healthcare utilization at this point, right? The CT was essentially unrevealing except for some stool in the colon. Even had a GI consult where they recommended using Miralax to kind of keep things moving and make sure she's not having any issues with constipation that could be contributing to the abdominal pain, gas, or bloating, right? So she's still not tolerating enteral formula. So what do we do now? Do we try and add the pancreatic enzymes? Do we change her to a peptide-based formula, blenderized tube feeding, plant-based formula, refer her to surgery, again, another GI consult, or do we change her to TPN, saying that it's not going to work? And in this situation, we've started to explore using peptide-based formula quite a bit. And as I mentioned before, there's some theoretical benefits, right? One, the protein is broken up into di and tripeptides. And you could see we actually have transporters for that. So there's not a lot of processing that the body has to do to get to this level. It's already been done for that absorption. And in certain situations, like in patients with small bowel, we could see that receptor, the PEPT1, that I mentioned, it's upregulated. So our body starts to express more of it, when we have situations of malabsorption, such as in the small bowel. The other part is in terms of lipids. As I mentioned, those long chain fatty acids before, they're quite long. They don't mix well with water, right? Oil and water don't mix well. And so what starts to happen is, again, you need a lot of processing. You need to break them down into smaller and smaller particles so that they can be absorbed. And when they are absorbed, as I'm trying to show you here, they then go through quite a bit of processing and get converted into these particles we call chylomicrons. And they don't go to the liver through the portal circulation directly, but instead go through the lymphatics. That takes us all the way to the thoracic duct, and they're released into our blood circulation, where they sort of float around and finally reach the liver, right? You compare that to medium chain triglycerides, which are much smaller, don't need that degree of processing, can be readily absorbed and go right to the liver. So more readily absorbed. And when they get to the liver, you know, these medium chain triglycerides, fatty acids, they can go right into the mitochondria and be oxidized. Whereas the long chain, they're too long to cross that double membrane of the mitochondria. So they have to be taken across by this carnitine transport. And again, all that just requires work to get it there. So a lot of theoretical benefits, but what does the clinical data show us? Here's one of the studies in abdominal surgery patients where they were looking at 19 patients after major abdominal surgery who were then randomized to peptide-based formula through a jejunostomy versus parenteral nutrition. And you can see the big difference there in cost, right? Parenteral nutrition was just more costly, but both were able to meet their nutritional needs. And in the peptide-based formula, most were able to avoid use of parenteral nutrition. Same thing in pancreatitis. They've looked at use of parenteral nutrition, which we rarely do anymore. We try and provide nutrition past the pancreas if we're able to. Again, using peptide-based formula compared to parenteral nutrition in this study, looking at nutrition, looking at how quickly the pancreatitis resolves, you can see no major difference aside from a major difference in cost, right? So compared to parenteral nutrition, peptide-based formulas have been shown to be just as good, but much, much more cost-effective. But what about compared to standard polymeric formulas, right? In this case, 30 patients, pancreatitis, randomized to either peptide-based or standard polymeric formulas, both through jejunal feeds. And you can see overall tolerance was pretty good for both of them, right? But the big difference was in the length of hospital stay. Much shorter for the peptide-based formula compared to the standard polymeric formula, right? Weight loss was also much less in the peptide-based formula compared to the standard polymeric. This is a study looking at patients with HIV. Again, before many of the drugs we had that can effectively manage. In this situation, you could see compared to standard formula, peptide-based formula led to a weight increase compared to weight loss, right, and lower rates of hospitalization as well. So, you know, a lot of hospital data, a lot of post-surgical data. We wanted to look at, well, what about the home enteral nutrition practice? So we looked at our own practice, you know, looked at patients who were placed on peptide-based formulas between January 1st, 2016 and May 1st, 2018. We had 95 patients in that time frame. 53 of them were started directly and 42 switched from another formula. And here's sort of the baseline data, you know, the primary diagnosis. You could see the differences between those who were started directly on the peptide-based formula versus those who were switched, especially for the indication, right? Those who were started directly were really patients who our team felt were going to have issues with malabsorption, you know, pancreatic insufficiency, where there's a lot of data to show benefit. Those who were switched were really switched because of intolerance. And so this gave us a unique opportunity. Here's sort of the formulas we switched them to, but it gave us a unique opportunity to look at this and to see what happens before and after in this population. And you could see dramatic decrease in symptoms of nausea, diarrhea, almost cut in half. Abdominal pain, cramping dramatically reduced, distension. You can see that patients having no symptoms went from 21 all the way to 49%. But what was really shocking to us, and I think something we just forget in the day-to-day of just, the clinic, we get phone calls, we get in baskets, we see patients, was that healthcare utilization. After switch, dramatic decrease, right? Average number of phone calls dropped. Number of ER visits, you can imagine the cost that's associated with that, right? Number of visits with our own providers. And this is where the data is hard to get to. But when I looked at studies, showing average cost of an ER visit for a GI symptom complaint, you could see it could range anywhere from $2,000 on the way to $5,000, especially if the patient gets admitted or there's a CT scan. It can be quite costly. So even one of these, if we can avoid them, can pay for a long time of formula, right? Same thing we did for our pediatric population. 30 patients, 21 started directly, 9 switched from another formula. And you could see the background, the baseline characteristics there, indications, the formula we used. But really, when we get back to those same graphs of before and after in those patients who switched, you could see dramatic reduction. Again, very small group. We need bigger, population, but dramatic reduction, diarrhea, nausea, vomiting, complete resolution of abdominal pain, cramping, gas, bloating, constipation. So big difference. Same thing in terms of healthcare utilization. Look at the difference in provider visits, phone calls, ER visits. Again, this is a population compared to the adults with a little bit more ER healthcare utilization. So dramatic reduction there. Other groups have also looked at this. I call this real world data. Mayo's real world too, we like to think. But in this case, they use medical claims data, assess the impact of transition to peptide-based formula in over 1,000 adult home enteral nutrition patients. Again, you could see the breakdown, but this is the key. Same sort of finding. So very reassuring that it confirmed what we found in that reduction before and after in GI distress. And then again, reduction in healthcare utilization as well. Right? Same thing in the pediatric population. You start to see the pattern, right? Dramatic reduction in GI distress, GI symptoms before and after. Same thing with healthcare utilization. And so just to kind of summarize, home enteral nutrition is definitely becoming more prevalent, and I think rightfully so. The data supports this. But when we have, over 400,000 Americans on parenteral nutrition at home, complications are going to arise. So we really need to be well equipped in being able to manage their complications that arise, especially those in terms of intolerance symptoms. And one of those, approaches can be to use peptide-based formulas. And I've shown you the data from our group here, adult. Here's the real-world adult patients, pediatric, and real-world pediatric, so the top are ours, showing that reduction in GI distress with the use of peptide-based formula. So I think in our patient, we perhaps waited too long. This was before the work we had done, but we did finally transition her to a peptide-based formula, and she was able to tolerate it much, much better. Met her nutritional needs, and we received this message, which is just, exactly what you want at the start of your day. And she said the symptoms of pain, bloating, gassiness, and general feeding difficulties have all but resolved, starting to feel stronger, have more energy, doing my activities of daily living now without so much effort. I really feel that all of the changes that were made have definitely shown great benefit, and I'm so happy. So just a delight to get that message. So with that, thank you so much for your attention, and I'll look forward to answering any questions you may have.
So Mary, whenever you're ready, we can start your presentation. We look forward to hearing it.
Good morning. It looks like I need some permission to start my video.
While Don's working on that, I'll mention to Dr. Mundi said he would take questions. He obviously didn't think that one through. So
Mary, I'm going to run your PowerPoint from my computer.
Okay.
Oh.
I'm getting a pop-up that says I can't start my video because the host has stopped it.
Let me, give me a second. There you go. You should be good.
Good morning. I'm here today to speak about managing common complications of tube feedings. My name is Mary. I've been a dietitian for about 30 years. I've been working with Shield Healthcare and primarily, specifically with those patients on home tube feeding for about 10 years now. It's become a tremendous passion of mine, and I am very excited and honored to be presenting here today at Oley. So next slide, please. So some of our objectives today, and what we're going to spend about the next 20 or 30 minutes on, are talking about really what can go wrong when you're at home with a tube feeding. And we'll start with some quick statistics from FASPEN. Then we'll talk about what some of the common complications are. And then lastly, we'll discuss how to manage and prevent these issues. Next slide, please. 50,000, wow, that's a big number. That's the number of patients who go home on tube feeding each year just in the United States, according to a study conducted by FASPEN and published in 2017. So just to give you a frame of reference for some of the things that we'll be talking about, I want to just kind of talk about who are these patients or what type of feedings are they going to have? And you can see from the graphs here that they are overwhelmingly primarily G-tube fed. Smaller proportion GJ, even smaller J tube, and then about the same amount, 8% of NG or NJ tubes. And the administration type is primarily bolus via gravity or syringe, and then patients using pump comprise of the other percentages. Next slide, please. And why should we talk about managing a home tube feeding complications? It's important. It's really important. One study showed that almost a quarter of the patients discharged home went back into the hospital within the first 6 months because of problems related to their tube feeding. So I'd like to stop and kind of pause on that. So 25% of patients that were discharged home on a tube feeding were readmitted specifically related to a problem with their tube feeding. What percentage of those readmissions could have been avoided? We don't really know, probably a fair amount of them. So that's what we're here to do, is to kind of try to talk through some of these things that can be prevented or solved at home. Then there's malnutrition. When you don't get enough nutrition because of problems related to your tube feeding, the risk of malnutrition increases. Malnutrition makes you more prone to infection, delayed wound healing, and other issues that could land you back in the hospital. And we also, of course, one of the main goals of Oley is to improve the quality of life. In one study, over 60% of the people on tube feeding at home had problems like nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, and constipation. Next slide, please. So here are some of the common complications that we'll touch on today. I've broken it up into gastrointestinal or gut related, and then the other kind of side of the coin would be the tube related or the mechanical complications. And as a bonus, because we all love to talk about ENFIT, we'll be talking about enteral misconnections, which are a less common complication of home tube feedings, but one can result in serious injury or even death. And please note, I am speaking about ENFIT today, not a lot, but do note, please, that there is an entire presentation on it tomorrow. Next slide, please. So one of the main complications, one of the biggest problems that we have, especially with patients right away when they're getting a tube feeding, right when they're getting home, perhaps they haven't eaten for a while, their gut's just really sensitive, is nausea and vomiting. It's kind of the knee jerk to blame it on the formula. What we found through trial and error and years of experience is that it generally isn't the formula. So some of the things that we want to look at are if you experience nausea, usually it's the rate of the feed that maybe is going to be one of the main culprits, and slowing down the rate may help. If you're syringe feeding, what that can mean is giving only a quarter or a half of a can at a time, and perhaps even waiting a few minutes in between those kind of boluses that you're giving. You can also try lowering the syringe closer to your stomach to help slow down the rate of the flow. Just always remember that the higher the syringe is above your body, the faster the formula will flow in by gravity. If you're using a gravity bag to feed, you can slow the rate by closing or adjusting that roller clamp that pinches the tubing so that the formula is allowed to slow down. And then with a feeding pump, of course, we have many different ways that we can control the rate there. We adjust the numbers on the screen. We can lower the rate by half and see how that feels. And if you feel better, then slowly increase the rate to a point where you can feed without nausea. Really important, if you ever experience vomiting, stop the doctor and call your doctor stop the feeding and call your doctor immediately. And let your doctor know, of course, if you can't tolerate your formula at the recommended rate, you may need to change your feeding regimen to get all of your nutrition in. There's many different ways to feed, many different feeding regimens. One size does not fit all, and something that you tolerated in the past, you may not be able to tolerate now. So it's important to not just kind of bear through that and know that there's ways that feedings can be adjusted so that it can be tolerated and you can get the nutrition that you need. Next slide, please. So another one, a big one, is it constipation? Is that causing the nausea and vomiting? So we should always consider when your last bowel movement was, and constipation may be suspected if you haven't had a bowel movement in some time, or you're having them less than 3 times a week, or if you're having pain or difficulty passing hard, dry stools. A change in your usual bowel habits may also indicate constipation. Next slide, please. So is the tube in the right place? That's something that maybe we don't think of right away, but this is of vital importance, as you can imagine. If the tip of your feeding tube has moved outside of its place inside of your stomach, it can cause stomach irritation and nausea. So pay attention to the markings on your tube feeding, on the tube, and how far the external bolster is from your skin. There should be about the width of a dime in between that hard external bolster and your skin. And if your tube has a button, you should check the amount of water that's in that balloon. If your tube has a balloon, you should check that amount of water in the balloon on a regular basis to make sure that that balloon is still intact. Next slide, please. So more tips to kind of try to conquer this very common complication of tube feeding is make sure that you're sitting up or the head of the bed is elevated during and for at least 30 minutes after you're feeding. Make sure that you're not using cold formula. Don't pull it right out of the fridge. Cold formula sometimes can cause stomach upset, so you may want to let it warm up to room temperature before using it. Another complicated one, or something that happens sometimes, is that your feeding regimen may be to give your bolus of feeding in addition to water at the same time. So it could be, something like 120 mLs of water before and after your feeding, and then a can of formula. That's a lot of liquid into your system all at once, and sometimes that can cause a little bit of GI upset. So it may be better for you to actually separate the feedings a bit from the water flushes so that you're not getting quite such a large load of fluid all at once. Also, additionally, be sure that you're priming the extension set and the pump set before the feeding to prevent pushing air into the stomach. And then if we've gone through all of these, so you've slowed down the rate, you've maybe reduced the quantity, you've separated the water out from the formula. So we're kind of trying everything. If all else fails, then perhaps this is the time to trial a different formula. Next slide, please. But is it the tube feeding? Or is it diarrhea? This is an important one. It's kind of important to talk about really what is diarrhea. So diarrhea is going to be large watery stools. If you get all your nutrition from a tube feeding, remember that your bowel movements may not look the same as they did perhaps when you were eating regular table food, but you shouldn't have large watery stools. Loose stools may be the result of too much formula too fast, and the solution may be just to slow it down like we talked about earlier. Additionally, if you slow down your feeding, we may need to feed for a longer period of time to get in all the formula that's prescribed. Let your healthcare team know if you make any changes to your feeding. That's really important. And if slowing down your feeding doesn't help, it may be something else. Your doctor or dietitian may try a formula with nutrients that are already broken down, or one that doesn't contain common allergens such as milk, soy, eggs, wheat, or nuts. Next slide, please. So it could be an infection as well, that diarrhea. So especially if you've been on antibiotics in the past few months, or if you've been hospitalized in the past few months, we may want to test for this. And it's especially important if you've had a gastrointestinal infection in the recent past. Next slide, please. Some medication can cause loose stools as well. The very common culprits are antibiotics, laxatives, promotility agents such as Reglan, and liquid medications containing sorbitol. Chat with your doctor or pharmacist about this. They can help you determine if any of them are contributing to the problem. And if you are taking liquid medications, it's a good idea to typically dilute them with water to decrease the chance of them causing loose stools. Next slide, please. Ask your doctor about whether maybe perhaps you should start taking a probiotic supplement. Probiotics are live bacteria that provide health benefits, and certain strains have been shown to be effective in preventing the diarrhea that's associated with antibiotic use. It may be helpful to try a formula that contains fiber. Insoluble fiber adds bulk to stools and supports the good bacteria in your colon. And certain types of fiber called prebiotics are food for the good bacteria in your colon. When they process the prebiotics, they help to inhibit the disease-causing bacteria, promote the absorption of water from the colon to make stools more formed, and provide the energy for your cells in your intestine. Some formulas do contain these prebiotics, and one example of that would be the agave inulin. So if you're having diarrhea, you want to minimize your risk of becoming dehydrated. Continue your tube feeding at the rate that you can tolerate, and continue to give yourself water through the tube. If you're unable to tolerate the formula and water, please tell your doctor immediately. Next slide, please. Constipation is actually more common than diarrhea in people who are tube fed at home. If you're constipated, the first thing you should consider is whether you're getting enough water. Your tube feeding formula contains some water, but it may not be enough to meet your needs. I see this very commonly. Patients are discharged home with a formula regimen, but without a free water regimen. Somebody may need up to an additional liter or so of fluid a day. outside of the water that they're getting within the tube feeding. So this is really important. And remember that some formulas contain more water than the others. You can see from the chart, a 1.0 or 1.2 calorie per ml formula has more water in it than a 1.5 or a 2 calorie per ml formula. And the water that you need depends on certain factors, including your age and clinical condition. And your doctor or dietitian can tell you how much additional water you should add to meet your needs. And adding water to your tube also helps to keep it clear and unclogged. And this is something that I go over many times. We flush the tube for two reasons. We flush the tube to ensure tube patency, and then we also need to flush the tube to ensure that we're getting enough water. And in a few minutes, we'll talk about how to use water to clear the clog if your tube becomes blocked, the bane of every tubie's existence. Next slide, please. So fiber, we all talk about this. So getting fiber can also help with the constipation. Fiber actually draws the water into your colon to make the stool softer. This also helps to add weight to the stool to move it through your colon faster. And fiber adds bulk to the stool. The extra bulk puts pressure on the wall of your colon, which can help speed things up. Formula without fiber is often associated with constipation. And ask your doctor or your dietitian if you're getting enough fiber. Next slide, please. So let's switch gears now a bit and talk more about going a little bit outside of the body and talk about complications that occur with skin around the feeding tube. And look at this beautiful stomacite. This is what the skin around the feeding tube should look like. Not always, but should. Next slide, please. So leakage around the tube, what's going on there? So the skin may look more like this if there's leakage around the feeding tube, and leakage of the stomach fluids can occur if the tube fits too loosely. So we always want to check the external bolster or the balloon volume. To help with that, you can apply a skin protectant or moisture barrier, and then use a short-term dressing such as gauze to help absorb that drainage. Generally, if the G-tube site is clean and dry, we say you don't need gauze, don't use it. But if there's any moisture, anything that needs to be absorbed, that's the time to add gauze or some other device there. A fabric device, whatever works for you, makeup sponges to help absorb some of that moisture. Leakage of the stomach fluids again can occur if the tube just fits too loosely. It may need resizing as well. And this may be also because the external bolster has moved up the tube or the balloon doesn't have the right amount of water. So those are kind of our problem solving with the leakage. Be sure that you have the right size tube, that the bolster is in the correct place, and that the balloon is filled to the correct amount of water. Next slide, please. Ouch, this one always makes me say ouch. So pressure necrosis, is the tube too tight? On the flip side, if the tube is too tight against your skin, the pressure can cause damage to the skin. And you may notice redness, irritation, and pain around the tube. You can see that this tube here has just been pulling on that site and causing some necrosis or damage to that area. You can see that the bolster also has been moved away. Next slide, please. Hypergranulation tissue is exceptionally commonplace. We see this a lot, and it may show up as discolored, irritated, or raised skin around the tube. You can help prevent it by only using mild soap and water for routine cleaning of the skin around the feeding tube. And you should also stabilize the tube so it doesn't move around too much. This occurs when there's kind of a constant rub from the device, the button or the G-tube against the skin, and the skin kind of builds up, our body builds up this additional tissue to help kind of make a little buffer there because it's being irritated. So to prevent the hypergranulation tissue, we want to try to remove that irritation. Some people do better with switching out a different brand of a low profile device or a different type of G-tube as well. Next slide, please. Bacterial yeast infections really usually come from the skin just being too moist. So how we treat this or how we prevent this is always to wash your hands before touching the skin and to clean the site daily and try to keep it dry. An infection may occur, so you may notice pain, inflammation, redness, drainage with an odor or a color. So again, what we really want to do is try to keep our hands clean anytime that we're giving a feeding or treating or cleaning around the tube site, and also try to keep that site around your tube as clean and dry as possible. Next slide, please. Regular care of the skin around your feeding tube should include all of these things, just as we've been talking about. Wash your hands, rotate the tube a quarter of a turn, not with J-tubes, however. Check your external bolster height, secure the tube so that it's not moving too much, and keep the area clean and dry. If you notice any or experience any skin issues around your tube, contact your doctor or nurse right away. Next slide, please. Ooh, here's the big one, clogged feeding tubes. This is a doozy. We talk a lot about prevention, and prevention is really where we want to start and encourage. And really the best ways to do that is just to flush with water. Flush very regularly with water every time you use the tube and every few hours when not in use. So how do you know that your tube is clogged? Well, things aren't going to go through. You may be trying to administer a medication or the formula. It just won't push through. You may run on the pump, and the pump is yelling at you, no flow out. What's happened is that your tube has become clogged with either dried medication or formula. So to prevent this is to flush on a very regular basis. Your doctor or your dietitian should be able to tell you how much water to use, but a good rule of thumb is to flush before and after every feeding, before and after every medication, and every few hours, even when the tube is not in use. We want to use water to flush your tube. Other liquids such as juice and carbonated beverages, although I don't think they're as commonly used as they used to try to unclog a tube, can really possibly make that clog worse. So we want to, excuse me, just use water when flushing the tube. Next slide, please. So preventing the clogged tube, medications are the main reason that most tubes become clogged, but you can help prevent a clog by giving your medications separately from each other and by flushing after each one. As a general rule, avoid adding medication or really anything to the formula. Mixing the two can cause clumps in your formula, which may clog your tube. And review your medications with your doctor or pharmacist. Not all forms of medication should go down your feeding tube. Next slide, please. If you're unable to get the water or formula through your tube, first check to make sure that it's not clamped or kinked anywhere. Then try these steps to clear the clog. You may need to repeat them a few times. If you still can't clear it or use your feeding tube, notify your nurse or doctor. They may have other ways to unclear the clog, such as enzyme or mechanical devices. If the tube cannot be cleared, it may need to be replaced. Tube dislodgement. So managing and preventing for the tube dislodgement, to manage it, so if the tube does come out, what you want to do is replace the tube. Even if the button's burst or the balloon is burst, go ahead and put it back in and tape it down until you can have that replaced with an intact G-tube. And to prevent that, mark the outside of the tube, check the external bolster, and check the balloon per your healthcare professional. Again, it's very important to keep the tube or tubing of similar size in until you can get the tube replaced, because the stoma can close in just a couple of hours. Next slide, please. Enteral misconnections occur when enteral devices, such as feeding tubes, are accidentally connected to non-enteral devices, such as IV lines, respiratory tubing, or urinary devices. For example, formula can be inadvertently infused into the veins through an IV line into a respiratory tubing. The FDA has received reports of deaths and injuries related to enteral misconnections, and it's thought, though, that many enteral misconnections don't get reported to the FDA. So I'm going to touch on this very quickly because, again, there will be an entire presentation tomorrow on ENFIT, but I just do want to touch on it because it is a complication of tube feedings. So the best way that we want to prevent these enteral misconnections is to use feeding tubes, pump sets, and syringes that are physically incompatible with IV, respiratory, and other non-enteral devices. So what is that? What does that mean? I think we all know this word. ENFit is the brand name for the enteral connection that is physically incompatible with other non-enteral devices. Again, I'm going to save a lot of this for tomorrow. It'll be gone over in great detail by Vicki. I am happy to report that it seems like there seems to be an uptick in awareness and conversions to ENFit throughout the industry. I'm grateful for the manufacturers to get on board and to help promote this transition. So I see us really kind of starting to have an uptick in patients and facilities converting over to ENFit, which is gratifying to see. Next slide, please. You know, sometimes we still do have some patients that are home, perhaps on ENFit or still home on Legacy, and the hospital is using ENFit or using Legacy, and the two kind of don't match. It's important that what you have at home all works together. So if there's an ENFit tube placed, you need to be sure that you have ENFit supplies at home. So what can you do? Contact your home medical supply company. Ask your hospital if they have ENFit supplies. If you're being admitted and you have an ENFit tube, but the hospital is still using Legacy, you may want to bring in your own supplies. And also learn more at stayconnected.org or Oley.org as well. You want to be sure that as you go between home and hospital that your tube can be accessed and enteral misconnections are prevented. So my references, next slide. And I can open it up to any questions now.
Thanks so much, Mary. We do have several questions. The first one is, and maybe you can't answer it specifically, but maybe you can give a tip on how to determine the answer. But Jennifer asks if there's a standard amount of water or saline to that should be in the balloon. And is it in the balloon of a low profile device? And is it different for different tube types and sizes?
Okay, yeah, I can answer that for sure. So no, it varies dependent on the size of the G-tube. So each G-tube should say on it, whether it's a low profile device, you would find it in the literature that came with it, or whether it's a regular G-tube. It could be anywhere between 3 and 20 mLs that would go into that balloon. So it really is specific to the size of the G-tube.
Thank you. And Bethany's asking for a type of healing cream. If you have any suggestions for healing creams to use around the tube, in addition to camiseptine, which she's already familiar with.
I do not. I don't know if there's anybody else on the panel that can jump in and I guess another question would be, what are we trying to heal? What is actually the issue? I'm sure that needs to be probably addressed by a physician to make sure that it's not a bacterial situation that perhaps might need a topical antibiotic, or whether it's hypergranulation that would need some silver nitrate. So it's a little hard to answer. I don't know if somebody else would want to jump in on that one.
That's a good point. I don't think we have anybody else on the call that has this expertise at this moment. But there is a conversation going on in chat where some people are making some different suggestions. Yeah. And Brian has a question, which I hear, this comes up every now and then, but I like his wording. He says, is there a group of the Pink Stoma Society members? I have never, ever been able to keep my stoma clear. So is it actually achievable?
Yes, it is achievable. It can be, I think it's just some patients, some people just have difficulty keeping it looking healthy and dry. And it just has to do more with not the skin integrity, but just kind of their own composition, and really nothing that's being done incorrectly. I think for some, it just is a kind of a constant battle that you have to try to keep manageable and not let it get out of hand, but perhaps it would never go away.
Thanks, that makes sense. I will do one more question, and I don't know if you're available to, I know you have a really busy day, but I just wondered if you have a chance to go on, and I don't know if you are that familiar with Zoom either. I know you don't usually use Zoom for your meetings, but if you can answer any of the questions in the Q&A written, that would be terrific. If not, we'll encourage people to maybe email or to look at some of the other resources on our website where some of these answers might be found. But one more, maybe two more. One is quick, I think. How often should a J-tube be replaced?
That's really going to be up to the gastroenterologist and the IR team, I would say. My general feeling on that, and I'm not an interventional radiology expert, would be if just to leave it until there needs to be it changed, or perhaps at least once a year.
Great, thanks. And then the other question was about granulation tissue, granulation. The Asher says, my son is connected 24/7 due to short gut. His surgeon said there's no way to prevent it when he's connected all the time, but do you have any tips that maybe they haven't tried? He said, we do have the tube stabilized, and his son is 2 years old with a low profile device.
I did have somebody, and I mentioned it briefly in my talk. I had, so for us ladies out there, there's round makeup sponges. I had somebody say that they had great success with those. They would cut a slit in them and put them around the G-tube, and that really helped keep that buffer to keep the skin from being irritated. That's something you can try. If gauze isn't helping, then perhaps one of the fabric pads that you can put in that are easily available might be a better help.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary. I really appreciate your helping and jumping in to give this presentation. It was fabulous. And all those questions are just so important and critical. We really appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks. Next, we'll have let's see. Sorry, I've lost my place here. Next, we'll please welcome Carol Ireton-Jones. Carol, welcome. Carol will speak on the topic of eating challenges. Dr. Ireton-Jones has presented at many Oley conferences. She's a familiar face, and she has a private practice where she manages patients with GI disorders and home tube feeding and IV nutrition patients. So Carol, welcome.
Thank you so much. The first thing I want to say is congratulations, Joan Bishop, job well done. And we will miss you, but hopefully we don't have to miss you right away. So yay, congratulations, Joan, for a job well done. And welcome, Beth, except we already know you. So this is going to be great. All right, I have slides. So I'm going to share my screen perhaps, and we'll see what happens. It looks like it's happening. If Lisa, if you could just confirm. Well, it says participants can now see my application, so I hope you can.
We can.
All right. Well, I'm going to turn my screen a little bit. Let's see if I can do this to show you that, yes, indeed, I have show and tell for today. So I've been to the store, I've done a little eating and grocery shopping here for you. My goal is to talk to you about eating challenges. I've enjoyed all of the presentations today on home enteral nutrition. I'm sure there's plenty of great ones going on home parenteral nutrition, but somewhere along the line, a lot of people like to eat and they wonder what they can eat, what your challenges are. So I'm going to spend some time on that today, and I look forward to your questions and comments. I wish we were in person so you could just say them out loud. These are my disclosures, but I wanted to let you know that my biggest disclosure is to say thank you to all the consumers that have contributed to my knowledge that isn't in the books. It seems whenever I've said something like, well, the one thing you shouldn't do is X, and one of you will say, well, that worked great for me. So I don't have any shouldn'ts, I have suggestions. Okay, nutrition. You knew I was going to talk about just the basics, but for almost all of you, And I know we have, I'm here in the Enteral group, so some of you are tube feeding only. You may not be able to eat much or at all, but and I thought that when Lisa was speaking, she did a great job of kind of a nutrition primer. So if you are in fact making your tube feeding, these are some things that you need to know. And for those of you who are on parenteral nutrition, picking out what to eat is important, because while you might have enteral nutrition to provide your nutrients or parenteral nutrition to provide your nutrients, what you eat can really help you improve your nutrition, or actually can be a problem if it's something that causes increased output. So the macronutrients are protein, carbohydrates, and fat. Fat has 9 calories per gram, so it's the most calorically dense. And yes, we need fat. We need fat every day. So those of you who are on a tube feeding, you'll notice that there's fat in your tube feeding, sometimes more, sometimes less, but you do have to have fat every day because fat is essential. For carbohydrates, typically we like to maximize complex carbohydrates. And so some of those complex carbohydrates are things, oh, here this is my shopping container. I have things like brown rice pasta, or some of you might like regular pasta, but either way, these are complex carbohydrates and usually well tolerated by people who have GI intolerances. Sometimes it just may be the difference between gluten-free and not gluten-free. And here's one even that is chickpea. So there's lots of different ways to get complex carbohydrates in besides just a plain pasta, many different kinds of pastas, breads, and cereals. I have my bagel here. It's now hard as a rock. I don't think this is going to be for consumption, actually. Now, when it comes to whole grains and fresh fruits and vegetables, those are on an as tolerated basis. Some softer fresh fruits and veggies may be well tolerated, but some of you may not tolerate a fresh fruit because of the fiber in it, or if you have a part of your small intestine that has is smaller in size, maybe has a stricture, you want to be very careful about the fiber that you take in. So cooked veggies and fruits, skinned fruits, etc., those might be better for you. Now, something we can almost all agree on is how important protein is, and that's meat. So that could be pork, that could be beef, fish, poultry, and eggs. I put a picture of eggs here. They're not exactly my favorite protein, but they're pretty close because they are the gold standard for nutrition. They have about 7 grams of protein. It's well tolerated most of the time. I know as soon as I say that, somebody's going to say, no, I can't eat eggs at all. I know there are no rules in nutrition, I find. There's some great meat substitutes too, like tofu and tempeh, and milk and dairy have protein in them, and beans and peas. So again, you're going to choose what you tolerate best. I don't want to forget to talk about fluid, because fluid is very important as well. We talked about it in relation to those of you who are on a tube feeding. Not only do you need the nutrition that comes from the tube feeding formula, but you need the water, the fluid that comes along with it. And then of course, the micronutrients needed in very small amounts, but without them, you will not do well, because each of them have a very important function in the body and maximizing the way the nutrients that you take in and the macro and micronutrients are used. Now, who doesn't love this slide? I know everyone loves this slide. And this is if you've worked with your clinical team, we all want to know, okay, tell me about your GI tract. Do you have an intact GI tract that is, it's all there? Do you have your colon? How much of your GI tract is available? And that is why, because each one of these areas of the GI tract has roles in absorption of nutrients, also digestion, but absorption of nutrients is what we're talking about here. So, for example, you know, we ask a lot of questions about, hey, do you have your ileum? If not, we may need to provide you with some B12 supplements or B12 shots. So we just have to look at each of these different areas and see what you might be missing and what we need to provide to you. This is an old slide, but it's really one of my favorites. Now, diet for you, whether you're receiving enteral nutrition, parenteral nutrition, an oral diet, just trying to maintain as much as you can, you need a qualified registered dietitian. You really do. Somebody who knows what they're talking about. Now, in general, we usually say protein about 20 to 30% of calories. That's kind of a lot. But remember that many of you don't have a 100% absorption. So in this case, we may increase calories more than you would expect. We may increase protein a little bit more than you would expect, just because we want to account for any malabsorption. But, and if you have short bowel syndrome, we do want to consider the short bowel, how much is left, and also is the colon remaining. If you have a jejunostomy or an ileostomy, and this can apply to enteral or parenteral patients, then you may be able to tolerate a higher fat diet with moderate carbohydrate and higher salt. But if you have some colon remaining, then higher carbohydrate and perhaps a little lower fat, and also oxalates may be limited because of potential for fat malabsorption and fat to be and oxalates to be absorbed in the colon. Some people use the low FODMAP diet, which limits certain carbohydrates that may be associated with symptoms. But again, you need to talk to a registered dietitian who knows this stuff, because experimenting on your own, you may leave off some important nutrients. Some of you probably know this great source by Carol Parrish. You can get this free by going to the website here, shortbowelsyndrome.com. This is a great book. It does talk about all the things we have talked about and we'll talk about here today. And there's also one for pediatrics now. Okay, so I said there weren't any rules, but I guess there is a rule. And I think that Rick mentioned this early on in our discussion today when he said, sometimes I do pretty well with the enteral product I'm on, but sometimes I will use a substitute and it might have a little more sugar than I'm used to. So there is a carbohydrate caution. This used to be something I called a rule, but now I call it a carbohydrate caution. And that is, you want to minimize simple carbohydrates because these can increase fluid secretion into the GI tract and may increase diarrhea or ostomy output. So you know these: sugar, regular soda pop, excessive jelly and jam and syrup. You can have a little larger amounts of ice cream, sugar containing yogurts and drinks. And I wanted to point out up here that sugar is sugar. So sugar is sugar if it's honey, if it's blue agave, or if it's granulated sugar. Those are all sugars. Another thing to point out here, and I think many of you are doing this, especially those of you who've been around a little bit, when you drink a juice, you want to dilute it about 50-50. And that way they'll be better tolerated. Okay, some other nutrition challenges or eating challenges. This is what I find has come up with many of you and in my practice is texture, the feel, the touch, the consistency of the food that you are eating. So for some of you, you may need to change the texture or the consistency of your food to tolerate it better. For example, some people with gastroparesis may tolerate it, foods that have a mashed fork texture, or they may need pureed texture. So this is an example, you know, with the mashed fork, you just take your food and you mash it up so that it's done some of the work that needs to be done, so that perhaps this food will pass through the GI tract at a better rate. Puree, that can help as well, especially again with these gastroparesis patients or those who have some slowed motility. And you might even have to go to thin liquid or thin liquid strain. So the magic bullet can do it, but don't forget to strain. And that is something that may be important to you all as you're using these blenderized tube feedings, is the straining can be very important. I remember working with a patient, and she wanted mashed potatoes. So we made mashed potatoes to go down her feeding tube, and we even strained them. There wasn't much to strain, but she felt so good. And having mashed potatoes, even though they were going through a G tube, they gave her a great satisfaction. But if you have texture challenges, it's okay, embrace them. There are 10 people in the world that like cottage cheese. I am one of them, so there's only 9 others. But most people, when I say, have you tried cottage cheese? It's a great source of calcium and protein, magnesium, and they say, are you kidding me? Have you looked at it? Have you tasted it? So it's a texture that some people don't like. Another one is chia seeds. I love chia seeds. These are soluble fiber. They're great. They mix with all kinds of things, but they don't stay crunchy for very long. They tend to absorb the fluid with them. So if you're somebody who doesn't like that gel-like consistency, I tell you, you're going to put chia seeds on your oatmeal, put chia seeds on your oatmeal and eat it right then. But because if you go answer the phone and come back, yeah, they've been doing their thing, absorbing the fluid. And then of course, okra. I mean, who doesn't like okra? But I think okra fits smooth, slimy, tender, etc. So again, if you have challenges with texture, whether it's in your mouth or for your GI motility, you can manage those. Now, another thing that comes up is thirsty. So thirsty, I'm always thirsty. And so I thought you'd like these guys. I can't take credit for either of them, but I do have some of these guys at home. So you're thirsty. I bet many of you know the symptoms of dehydration. Boy, do we know it here. I live in Texas. It's been so hot. I've actually experienced a little bit of the dehydration from getting so hot. And so you feel it by a little bit of lightheadedness. Maybe you're increasing sweating, fatigue, maybe there's thirst, but again, sometimes when it goes so far, there's not even thirst. Decreased urine output and darker urine. Your heart rate may increase as well. So these are all symptoms of dehydration. So fluid intake is very important, but sometimes it is not water that will quench your thirst. So you may be putting water in with your tube feeding. Some of you may tolerate water, but many of you will do better on an ORS, which is an oral rehydration solution or an oral rehydration drink. It's low in sugar and contains a good amount of sodium. They sometimes contain potassium, sometimes they contain bicarbonate, but they're easily absorbed. So this will rehydrate you. I'm going to show you that WHO, the WHO organization ORS formula in a moment, but this is something that you make it in a liter container. This is one of my favorite liter containers because it reminds me to sip, but not too much. So you can do one of these. You can make something that this is even more than there's the 32 ounces here, so it makes even a little bit more than a liter. Oh my gosh, you can make it as cute as you want for making an oral rehydration solution. But these you sip, you don't chug these, because chugging the fluid, whether it's an ORS or whether it's water, that will not rehydrate you. It just goes through. Many of you can say that that's true. So a lot of you with short bowel or other reasons why you have GI impairment may use a liter or two per day of oral rehydration solution. Now, this is the oral rehydration solution formula that has been translated, and it's on the Oley website. And I've given you some good sources here from the Oley website, short bowel syndrome website, and from the University of Virginia website. And it uses water, just plain water, plus iodized salt. And this is a really great way to get iodine in. So iodized salt. And for the potassium, it's just salt substitute. So good old Morton salt substitute. Now, I must say, I've had a little bit of trouble finding this recently at the grocery store. But you can find it. And then you can just make it with table salt, sugar, and it's just regular sugar, and salt substitute, or you can just make it with water, table salt, and sugar. You need water, table salt, and sugar to make a oral rehydration solution. And this makes an entire liter. But if you are only using salt, sugar, and water, then you need to use about 3/4 of a teaspoon of table salt. But this is but if you're using the WHO formula that's on Oley, you can get this trisodium citrate dehydrate that is available from Amazon.com. And I will tell you, I bought this about 3 years ago. I don't think I'll ever use it up because you don't use very much of it. So this provides something that's about 70 milliequivalents of sodium. Very important, because that's about how much you want in your oral rehydration solution. So there's some that are already made up. One of them is Trioral. Another one is the Giannis Brothers. And this one actually has a little bit more. It has about 90 milliequivalents of sodium, which is really great. A lot of people enjoy that. Here's another one. It's Ceralite. But note that there are others that are out there, but they may not meet that 70 milliequivalent point that is the best to hydrate you with GI challenges such as short bowel syndrome. So for these, you may need to add some salt. Again, I agree with our previous speaker, talk to your dietitian. I think all of us have said that over and over again. Talk to the dietitian. Now, if you're a fan of something that you can take with you, G2 is one that a lot of people use. So, and it's hard to find lately. I'm not sure why, but G2 is the Gatorade that is low sugar. And so just get your G2, add a half a teaspoon of salt, shake it up, and it now is pretty close, 68 milliequivalents of sodium. If you use Gatorade, it's too much sugar. If you use Gatorade Zero, it's not enough sugar. So you need to use what's just right, which is G2 with some salt added to it. And again, you can use some of these others, but work with your dietitian, your nutrition team to find out what's best for you. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit about oxalates, not a lot, because you will not all need to limit oxalates, but you might have to if you've had your ileum removed, but you have a full or partial colon, because if you have fat malabsorption, fat binds to the calcium and it leaves the oxalates free to be absorbed by the colon, go into the kidney and form kidney stones. So these are some of the foods that need to be avoided. I always say, thank goodness I don't like beets, just kidding. But I know some of you do. But I just had a note from a colleague who works with kidney patients who are not short bowel syndrome, but need to manage their oxalates. And she mentioned that some of the plant milks are high in oxalate. And I hadn't really thought about that. So almond milk, cashew milk, and soy milk are some of the highest. Coconut milk and cow's milk are low. And you can use additional oral calcium in the form of calcium citrate. Again, talk to your clinical team. So a couple of points before we finish, and that is symptom management. So you may want to eat. The desire may not be the problem. It's just that you have symptoms. So this is what I've taken from you, my wonderful consumers, and these are things that I have gotten from you. In fact, even recently talking to some of my consumers. So if you have nausea, you might try some saltine crackers just to kind of set the stage, almost using the same sort of effect that pregnant women use when they're trying to eat, but they have some nausea because of pregnancy. Try some saltine crackers to settle your stomach, and then maybe you can go forward and eat what you'd like to eat, or eat a little bit. No appetite, or you don't feel like eating, but you know you need to, try some breathing techniques, some calming techniques, mindfulness, and then also eat what you can. If you get full too quickly, eat what you can and then go back. I know many of you are using this. We could call this eat small meals, but some of you would say, well, is 2 bites a small meal? Okay, it can be if that's what you want it to be. But you may have to take your time on that. And with the mindfulness, one of my recent consumers told me, I know I need to eat and I want to eat. So I just try to keep that in my mind as I'm trying to eat something. Maybe you have lactose intolerance. Well, remember that lactose does not mean all dairy. Lactose is highest in regular cow's milk and lowest in cheeses. So you can still have cheese. You can have an ounce of cream cheese on your bagel. So they're yellow cheese, mozzarella cheese. So there's a lot of Parmesan cheese. You can have a lot of those. Or you can use lactose-free products, lactose-free cottage cheese for the other 9 of you out there that like cottage cheese. There's lactose-free yogurt, or just eat small amounts of yogurt. It's about 4 ounces of yogurt should be tolerated. Dumping. Boy, I know many of you know about this. So you might need to figure out just how much you can eat and figure out, does anything help slow down your output? Does anything seem to solidify it a bit? Saltine crackers is something that was recommended. I always hear people talk about that marshmallows are something that help people with ostomies. I can't figure that out, but it is what people have told me that works well. Sometimes oatmeal, psyllium fiber may be helpful. Pretzels, you get the benefit of some salt on those as well. And then these are some foods that may cause a decrease in odor, like yogurt and kefir and even eating parsley. And then there are some gas-forming foods like beans and peas, broccoli, cauliflower, mushrooms, even garlic and onion. So again, a lot of it is trial and error, because as I said when I started, it just seems like if there's a rule, one of you has an idea and it has worked for you. So no rules, just suggestions. Now I wanted to bring this up because I think this is important, and it probably is important no matter who you are. whether you're a person who depends totally on enteral nutrition, totally on parenteral nutrition, or just can't eat like everybody else does. This is a paper that was written by Emma Tillman and I, and Emma and really did the bulk of the work in coming up with some scenarios. So if you don't have an option to take a look at this paper, please don't hesitate to email me. I'd be happy to send it to me. And I'm sure that the Oley Foundation and Lisa have a copy of this, so they could get it to you too. But I think that she has some things here. Find friends and family who take pleasure in your company without the worries of food, or enjoy activities that don't involve eating. I know we do so many things that involve eating, but maybe there's some activities you can start that you don't involve eating. Start incorporating non-food traditions into holiday and celebratory functions. Making crafts, doing outdoor things like bocce ball and those kind of things. I know everybody plays pickleball now, right? So, or do you have to be 65 and above? I don't know. But anyway, a lot of things. But just if you know that there's somebody that's going to be there that is going to cause the drama or ask you why you can't eat, then maybe you want to decide not to go with that person. And then remember that most of us are okay with just sitting there, with you sitting there, because we want you to be there. And then finally, I wanted to show this very quickly. Sometimes it's just very difficult to learn a different way of eating. This was a presentation that was done by myself, Carrie Shingleton, and Swapna Kakani, and it kind of went through Swapna's challenges of eating when she hadn't really eaten before, and now she had the opportunity to change and start to eat sort of whatever she wanted, but it was a challenge. So you may need to engage a multidisciplinary team of feeding and nutrition experts. So sometimes I am a great dietitian and I know all about short bowel syndrome, tube feeding, TPN, but I don't work with disordered eating. And so maybe somebody who really knows how to engage you that way might be a valuable member of the team. Also, what's your goal? Is your goal to be able to eat 3 bites a day? That might be a great goal. So that's fine. We can sustain you with enteral or parenteral nutrition, and then realize that there's not really a switch that you go from, okay, you couldn't eat before, to now you can eat. It may take a long time to learn to eat, and whatever it is that you can eat that provides you pleasure, and then also if it can provide you with sustenance, that's great. And with that, I would like to thank you so much for letting me talk to you and have the opportunity to show you my little groceries here that we went through. I would be happy to open it up for questions, and I've given you my email if there's anyone who would like to contact me. So Lisa, I'd be happy to take any questions if there are any.
There are, Carol. Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. It's interesting to look at it from almost different angles. So I don't know if you saw in the chat, but somebody posted that G2 is no longer being made. So.
G2 orange.
Oh, okay, just orange. Okay.
Yeah, and probably that's the one everybody liked, right?
Well, we can't find it near us either in upstate New York. We haven't seen any G2. So,
well, it's because those G2 people have already taken, and they bought the cases before you got there. So, I think that the challenge is that the general population knows about oral rehydration solutions, but they don't want sugar in it because they don't understand they're just drinking it instead of water. So they want a low calorie electrolyte solution, but really these low calorie ones are also low electrolyte as well. So if something says full of electrolytes, it probably isn't. One of my favorite low electrolytes, but says that it has electrolytes is coconut water. I don't know if anybody here drinks coconut water. A, how? Because I think it's gross. But B, it's not. It's really not. It has a tiny bit of magnesium, a little sodium. So it needs to be doctored up with all our goodies too, and some sugar as well.
That's funny. That was just came across as a question about coconut water.
Yeah.
And somebody else asks if ORS formula, oral rehydration solution formulas, are better than Pedialyte.
Great question. Great question. And I would say Pedialyte is your starter. So it has. Remember, I told you that we wanted to go for around 70 milliequivalents of sodium. That's because we're trying to get to the WHO formulation that we know rehydrates. So Pedialyte has about 45 to 50 milliequivalents of sodium. So again, Pedialyte is a little bit like drip drop and liquid IV. Not bad, just won't rehydrate you. So if you need a starter ORS to kind of get you going to the higher level, then that's great. And some people may do well with Pedialyte. I'm not saying it doesn't work. One thing I found with Pedialyte recently, and just about everything, is look at the label now, because Pedialyte now has one that has a bunch of vitamins added and some pro and prebiotics added. So just be careful to get the original version. Also, someone mentioned that there's flavored Pedialyte. I use Crystal Light in my ORS, and I think it helps. I am one of the guilty people about not drinking water either. So I think that adding some flavoring really helps. You could cut up some oranges, you can cut up lemon, lime, and just put it in there and let it flavor your ORS.
We had somebody recently write us about a product called True Lime, or True Lemon. It's like
yes, I like that.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
One other question, and then I will have to go on to the next speaker, but is about Bezors. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly.
I just love Bezors. That's pretty much, that is one of my favorite nutrition words. And so what a Bezor is when you do have gastroparesis or slow motility, and food cannot go through the GI tract from the stomach into the small intestine and be broken down, it will create a Bezor, which is a conglomeration of food. So I see that this somebody said broccoli. Broccoli may be one of those. It could be a fibrous type thing. So you do have to be very careful with those. One of my nursing friends, and the nursing friends give you the best example of Bezor. She said Bezor is like a hairball that a cat has. And so that, I suppose you could think of it like that. But that is something that we do worry about, and they could actually have to be removed endoscopically if necessary.
And are there foods that contribute more to them or less to them?
Yes, higher fibrous foods will contribute to those. So I think our broccoli person could eat some very well cooked broccoli. Probably wouldn't eat a ton of it, but some well-cooked broccoli, like the kind that our mothers made, that we decided we never would eat broccoli, and now steamed broccoli is like wonderful. Those are the kind of things, but that's where the fiber came in. It's kind of similar for people who have strictures. We're concerned about the fiber. We don't want anything to cause a blockage.
Thanks, Carol. Thank you for this really informative presentation and all those answers and for joining us today.
You're welcome. I'm looking forward to the rest of the meeting. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Next, we're going to have something very different. We're going to enjoy meeting the winners of the Oley Foundation's 2022 awards. So every year at our annual conference, we present some awards that members have nominated people for. And this year we have, I think it's 5 awards. And I want to say thank you to the award sponsors. We have Hanmi, Abbott, Nestle, NutriShare, and Vective Bio. And following the awards recognition, our last presentation will be about quality of life on nutrition support. Dr. Marion Winkler will talk about how to bring the subject up with your healthcare providers and what you can do to possibly improve your own quality of life. Dr. Winkler is a professor of surgery at Brown University School of Medicine in Providence, Rhode Island, and she's passionate about patient quality of life. So, Don, we're ready for the awards ceremony and everybody can sit back and enjoy. Thank you.
Welcome to Oley's 2022 awards ceremony. These 5 awards recognize those in our community who have earned our respect, inspired us, and taught us. We are excited to share with you these winners and nominees. Our first award is the Unsung HEN Hero Award, sponsored by Nestle Health Science. Our inspiring nominees include Brittany Dietrich and Madeline Zolik. This year's 2022 Unsung HEN Hero Award goes to Brittany Dietrich. Brittany was an energetic, engaging, and never the shy type of kid. It wasn't until the end of high school when Brittany became sick. After numerous hospital visits and years of being at wit's end, Brittany was finally diagnosed with gastroparesis, among other things. Once she finally found a formula that worked for her, and even a few years on TPN, she finally began to thrive. She focused on herself, getting better, and not missing another moment of her life. Her goal is to love others, remind them just how worth it they are, and to make her life a roadmap for someone else who might be going through the same things. Congratulations, Brittany. Our next award is the Unsung HPN Hero Award, sponsored by NutriShare. Our uplifting nominees include Brittany Dietrich and Madeline Zolik. This year's 2022 Unsung HPN Hero Award goes to Madeline Zolik. Madeline is a thriving 21-year-old who has been on TPN since 2017. She had GI issues on and off her whole life, but it wasn't until she was 14 that she required nutrition support. Years later, she was diagnosed with chronic intestinal pseudo-obstruction, among other things, and is now 100% dependent on TPN. Madeline struggled to find her footing in high school and made it her personal mission to help anyone she could, in any way she could. She says she knows what it feels like to be lost, alone, and sick, so she wants to help others through these tough times the best way she can. Madeline is currently an undergraduate student at New York University, studying in bioethics and public health policy with a minor in disability studies. She is currently navigating the pre-med track, hoping to become an MD, MPA, specializing in pediatric palliative care. We know you will do great things, Madeline. Congratulations. Our next award is the Rising Star Award, sponsored by Abbott Nutrition. These memorable nominees include Liam Brown, Damian Herrera, Albert Otero, and Olivia Scali. This year's 2022 Rising Star Award goes to Olivia Scali. Olivia's nutrition support journey began when she was 13 months old. Initially diagnosed with severe reflux and failure to thrive, she was unable to maintain a healthy weight and started enteral G feedings. Her symptoms continued, and Olivia's family spent the next 2.5 years traveling back and forth to Boston Children's Hospital. The travel took its toll, so the family decided to move from Pennsylvania to Massachusetts, and at 4.5 years old, Olivia clinically diagnosed with mitochondrial disease. Once Olivia's family felt comfortable with Olivia's care, they moved back to Pennsylvania. Olivia, who is now 15, is a thriving teenager who attends school, participates in extracurricular activities, as well as advocates and supports others within the gastroenterology community when the opportunity presents itself. Olivia is the first in line to attend organizational events to support awareness and advocacy for the nutrition support community. She has attended the United Mitochondrial Disease Foundation Symposium in Washington, D.C., and shared her story with congressional members on Capitol Hill. Most recently, Olivia won first prize in the Baxter Forever Bold contest. Keep doing great things, Olivia. Congratulations. Our next award is the Distinguished Clinician Award, sponsored by Hanmi Pharmaceuticals. Our impressive nominees include Sivan Kinberg, Donna Cloth, Vanessa Kumpf, Reed Nishikawa, and Christina Ritchie. This year's 2022 Distinguished Clinician Award goes to Donna Cloth. Donna has said she is and always will be a nurse. Over her 40 years of practicing, Donna says the most rewarding part has been to meet, teach, and support long-term nutrition support consumers. Donna's knowledge of home infusion and CVL care is extensive, and she was instrumental in assisting with the development of a home care company's nursing policy and procedures. Donna has also achieved advanced certification in the areas of IV nursing and nutrition support. She is both a certified nutrition support clinician through ASPEN and CRNI through the Infusion Nursing Society, highlighting her dedication to her role. Donna has been a true advocate for her consumers related to both their medical care and psychosocial well-being. Donna is available without hesitation to provide answers to clinical questions, advice regarding managing daily activities while on nutrition support, or just being that shoulder to cry on when someone needs it. She excels as a clinician, and we are proud to recognize her. Congratulations, Donna. Our final award is the Caregiver Extraordinaire Award, sponsored by Vectiv Bio. These uplifting nominees include Amber Ballack, Katie Clegg, Brianne Coffey, Luisa Hernandez, Jamie Kosmeric, Carol Leiby, Adam Roberson, and Ryan and Theo Yu. This year's 2022 Caregiver Extraordinaire Award goes to Adam Roberson. Adam's wife shared that he has been her lifeline since she was placed on TPN 7 years ago following a vagal nerve injury she incurred during a simple anti-reflux operation. Since then, Adam has never left her side, taking on her care with no complaints, only love and affection and unwavering support. Adam's love and pride is evident in his bio, as he first states husband and father for over 22 years. He enjoys quiet moments when he can be creative, enjoys the outdoors, and traveling with his wife. We thank you, Adam, for showing us all what a caregiver extraordinaire looks like. Congratulations. This brings our award ceremony to a close. Congratulations again to Brittany, Madeline, Olivia, Donna, and Adam. Catch our award winners' speeches and bios on our website. You don't want to miss them. A big thank you to all our winners, nominees, and sponsors for inspiring all of us. And remember, you don't have to be perfect to be amazing.
Hello, my name is Marion Winkler, and I'm very happy to be here today to talk with you about quality of life. Have you ever been asked by your doctor or healthcare team, how is your quality of life? When I was preparing for a conversation with a home nutrition support advocate recently, I asked that question. And surprisingly, the person responded, "No one's ever asked me that before. Let me think about that for a while." As clinicians, we are very aware of the time-consuming nature of home parenteral and enteral nutrition-related procedures, but I often wonder if we really understand what impact these therapies have on someone's lifestyle and family and personal relationships. Now, many of you know that I've been researching quality of life for most of my career. When I began reading about what others had published, and this is going all the way back to the 1980s, I found a body of work for TPN that found worse quality of life in home parenteral nutrition patients compared to healthy people or other patients who had intestinal diseases but did not require home TPN. And this worse quality of life was largely explained by decreased physical function, and it acknowledged that depression, pain medication dependency, sleep disturbances, frequent urination, fear of therapy-related complications, and the burdensome equipment and infusion schedule all influenced quality of life. For home enteral nutrition consumers, not being able to eat food, decreased sensory pleasure, body image issues related to having a feeding tube or having problems in the mouth with the ability to chew and swallow, sleep interruptions, inflexible schedules like having to fit your lifestyle around the feedings, travel challenges, altered family dynamics, social isolation, strained social relationships, and reduced self-esteem were frequently cited by researchers as having an association with poor quality of life. On the other hand, I was actually hearing from my patients and consumers like you who were attending Oley Foundation meetings that their quality of life was actually good and that they knew their nutritional therapy was keeping them alive, giving them the strength to do the activities they really wanted to be able to do. Another interesting fact I learned from studying quality of life was that physicians, clinicians, parents, and others often rate their patient or their child or their family member's quality of life much lower than the person or child rates their own quality of life when asked. I see this actually all the time in our clinic. We use a brief questionnaire to evaluate quality of life in our office and home nutrition program, and we're very surprised knowing what we know about the patient's lifestyle, their health and wellness, their disease state, and their feelings about having to do nutrition therapy every day, that they still rate their quality of life as good or very good. And it's less common in my experience to see someone rate their quality of life fair or poor. Yet that's sometimes what we expect we're going to hear. And it's often what we find in research studies that measure quality of life using generic health-related quality of life questionnaires. Now, quality of life among caregivers is also very important, and recently there's been a number of publications addressing this topic, and the topic explores caregivers of adults as well as parents of children caring for their children. Generally speaking, the research reports caring for someone with medical complex management, including home enteral or parenteral nutrition, is overwhelming, a significant burden, requiring a huge time commitment, affecting all aspects of family life, creating financial distress, and resulting in emotionally taxing feelings and exhaustion. The need for professional support for caregivers and for self-care is extremely important, without which caregivers and patients express that they feel like they're going to sink or swim if they're thrown into the deep end. Acquiring skills, competence, and confidence in the caregiving or self-care role helps to appreciate the benefits and focus more on positive experiences. Interestingly, a finding in a recent small study of parents of children with short bowel syndrome by Newman and colleagues reported that half of parents perceive their child's journey to have pushed them towards personal growth. And more than 2/3 of those parents perceive their child's quality of life to be higher than what they were told to expect at the time of diagnosis. So some of the reasons I decided to research quality of life was to better understand how consumers like you define quality of life and what factors influence your quality of life. Knowing this, as well as understanding what your goals and expectations are, is so important to establishing a good relationship with your doctor, your dietitian, your clinician, your home care or health care team. The question becomes, how best do you and we communicate and discuss quality of life and your goals and expectations? Healthcare agencies in the United States and really around the world have now developed tools and training to help healthcare professionals better engage patients and families in their decision making. The SHARE approach from the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality recommends 5 steps to engage in meaningful dialogue about what matters most to the patient. So they suggest as clinicians that we seek our patients' participation, help our patients explore and compare treatment options, assess our patients' values and preferences, reach a decision together with our patient, and evaluate our patient's decisions. When a clinician understands your personal experience, he or she is able to address what matters most to you. When you tell your story and are really listened to, communication happens at a whole different level. When we as clinicians really understand your life experiences, your goals, your expectations, we can have a meaningful conversation about quality of life. So let's think about quality of life and how you would define your own quality of life. If we look in the dictionary or conduct a Google search or look in the published nutrition research, we'll find a number of definitions, including this one from the World Health Organization. And I really want to know and have you think about whether any of these quality of life definitions resonate with you. So the WHO describes quality of life as an individual's perception of life in the context of their own culture and value system, and in relationship to their goals, expectations, and concerns. It's a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. And clearly, there's a subjective component of satisfaction and happiness in life. And in the dictionary, regardless of which one you look at, all of the definitions address well-being, enjoyment of life, and to the degree of which someone is able to enjoy activities of daily living. In the published literature in the nutrition support field, a number of definitions of quality of life have been offered. One is having no major physical complaints or psychological symptoms, no substantial restriction of social and leisure activities, overall satisfaction with conditions of life, and an understanding of the need for therapy. Frequently, it addresses satisfaction with both health and physical function, performance status, socioeconomic status, psychological and spiritual life, and family life and support systems. And when we look at the attributes influencing quality of life, the positive ones tend to be having no pain, feeling healthy, making others happy, feeling happy yourself, ourself, and being able to socialize and travel. Now, the general theme clearly among all these definitions are satisfaction, well-being, and enjoyment of life. What also is important for understanding quality of life is to know what factors actually influence quality of life, both positively and even negatively. And if we know this, we can help our patients overcome the negative attributes. We can develop strategies or address them so that we can move towards all of the positive ones. So some of the factors from my research in interviewing adults who use home TPN, I found that optimal quality of life was expressed as being able to do what I want to do when I want to do it. And the things people wanted to be able to do included working, household chores, attending community, church and social events, playing sports, eating and dining in restaurants, and in fact being able to eat what I want to eat when I want to eat it was really an important quality of life issue. Some of the positive factors associated with good quality of life were having good health, being happy, having strength and stamina, having strong faith, good family support, and financial security. And the negative ones, which again, we can, if we know, we can help to address them, are being in constant pain, feeling fatigued, having little or no strength or stamina, having ostomy leakage, or having disabling and disastrous diarrhea. Now, more recently, research has told us that the infusion schedule, both the number of days or nights per week and the number of hours it takes to give the feedings, greatly influences quality of life. Quality of life, not surprisingly, is better with time off nutrition therapy. Surprisingly, I'm finding that many consumers do not even know that there's possibility of having less nights, shorter infusion times, or even flexible feeding schedules. And what this means to me is that we as clinicians need to do a better job of discussing goals and expectations of therapy. Now, I need to say very clearly that less days or nights, shorter infusion times, and flexible feeding schedules for both TPN and tube feeding are not always appropriate for everyone. There are many considerations that we as clinicians take into consideration in establishing the number of infusion days and nights, or the length of infusion time, or the schedule for the feedings. But this is a topic that certainly can be addressed with your healthcare team. And any discussion you can have around the topic of putting your nutrition therapy into your lifestyle rather than having to fit your lifestyle around the nutrition schedule is definitely a quality of life issue. Consumers of home TPN and home enteral nutrition are resilient. And in my research, people talked about needing TPN as being hooked up, tied down, but happy to be alive. recognizing that the benefits of home nutrition therapy outweigh the burdens of having a central line or using an infusion pump. And in research conducted by Dr. Cheryl Thompson, home tube feeding consumers described enteral nutrition as a blessing, weighing the amount of life lived rather than the amount of time lost doing the feedings. So, how should you start a conversation about quality of life, or more specifically, about what is happening in your life with your doctor or healthcare team? First and foremost, always prepare for your visit. Second, write down the main points or questions that you want to address in order of your greatest concern. Sometimes a checklist is helpful. Third, tell your doctor or clinician in the very beginning of your appointment that you have specific questions and topics to discuss so that time is saved for you during the visit. Fourth, during your visit, speak up. Make sure that you get the chance to ask those questions. Make sure you understand what is being said. Ask for clarification. Restate what you heard to confirm that you understand the information correctly. Be an empowered consumer. Your healthcare team can provide the best care if they fully understand what is important to you and where you are coming from. Knowledge is important. Knowledge is empowering. Find resources. Many are available through Oley and on the website. Realize that you are not alone. There are many other people who share similar experiences to you, who you can learn from or who you can help. Build a broad network. Seek and be willing to ask for help. Join a support group. Expand your coping strategies. Keep a journal to record good days and accomplishments. This can be uplifting, especially on bad days. Keep a list of enjoyable activities that lift up your spirits. Turn problems into challenges and find creative solutions. Resolve negative emotions through breathing, exercise, yoga, and mindfulness activities. Incorporate food into your life, even if you are not eating it. Plant a garden, cook, sit at the table with family and friends. Enjoy the ambience and atmosphere and social conversation. Celebrate successes. Give yourself a pat on the back. Take credit for your accomplishments. Laugh more and relax. Be alive, be well, and be even better.
Thank you to Marion for that wonderful presentation. It's unfortunate Marion Dr. Winkler couldn't be with us today. She's her presentations on quality of life are always so inspiring. Marion will be presenting live on Thursday during the intestinal failure workshop and will be part of a panel discussion Thursday afternoon. The program for the schedule for that is on our website. So, and congratulations to our award winners. Very exciting to see them. We have a few videos from the award winners on our websites. And as we're able to get them up, we'll post more information about the other winners. So thank you to all of our presenters today. This wraps things up. I think it was a fabulous session. Thank you to everybody for participating. We're so grateful that you were all here and stayed with us to the end. This afternoon, please be sure to check out the marketplace with our ads from some of our sponsors and take the 3 challenges. For the challenges, consumers and caregivers 18 and older who score at least 80% correctly will be entered into a drawing, and 5 lucky winners will be offered their choice of one of 3 great prizes. Clinicians are also welcome to take the challenge for a fun learning experience. Sorry, I hope you could hear me. Links to the challenges are posted at oley.org/marketplace, all one word, 2022. A copy of the link is in the chat. Mary will post that there, please. You must complete the challenges by 12:30 on August 18th, which is Thursday, to be entered into the drawing. And then the winners will be announced at the closing remarks on Thursday. So again, the challenge is at oley.org/marketplace 2022. And then today we have the social hours starting at 3 o'clock from 3 to 4. Mary's just posted the Zoom links in the chat, so you can go from there. You can click on one of the links and it should bring you right to the social hour of your choice. We have more Fun for All, sponsored by 9 Meters Biopharma. We have a Parents Cafe, sponsored by Nestle. We have a Spouses Connection, sponsored by Handme, or a Meet the Ambassadors. That's about the Oley Ambassadors session. And Jam and Jammies is also at 3 o'clock as a reminder for those parents who have already pre-registered their children. This afternoon, you should get a link to a survey, an evaluation. We ask that you please complete the conference evaluation. Your feedback really is important. We do look at those. You should get an email from Zoom with a link to the survey. And in addition, if you're using Zoom through a web browser, you'll get a prompt to the Zoom screen with a link to the survey when you sign out of this meeting. We hope you'll all join us tomorrow at 11 o'clock Eastern Time for another full day of information and fun and connections. Thanks again. We'll see you tomorrow.